Chapter 2308. Time Crystal. It seems that I've really entered the time law area. Zhuo looked at his surroundings and let out a light sigh. In his opinion, the law of time was superior to the law of space. Before the law of time, everyone was equal. After entering this area, Zhuo could clearly see that his life was flowing away much faster here than in the outside world. Zhuo found a quiet desert and took out a map from his spirit ring. There were detailed markings on the map. His gaze fell on the time law area and discovered that there was a time divine river between the time law area and the spacetime law area. The time law in the time divine river was the most terrifying. It was said that cultivators who entered the time divine river would lose their lifespan hundreds of millions of times faster than in the outside world. Even though void sky cultivators had extremely long lifespans, they wouldn't be able to last more than a few days in the time divine river. They would gradually grow old and eventually die of exhaustion. Unless one mastered a certain amount of time law and slowed down the time flow in the time divine river, it was almost impossible to cross the time divine river. Zhuo looked around and discovered that the time divine river wasn't far away. The time law area wasn't big. There was only one space here, unlike the space law area, which had overlapping spaces that were densely packed like a maze. When Zhuo arrived at the time divine river, he discovered that there were 5 figures sitting cross-legged on the banks of the time divine river. Judging from the positions of the 5 figures, they were vaguely divided into 3 factions. 2 white-robed old men sat together in one faction. Another faction had a pair of Tao companions sitting on the other side. The last person was an extremely beautiful man. At this moment, the man was gently waving his folding fan as if he didn't see the hostility in the eyes of the other 4 people. Zhuo's arrival attracted the attention of the 5 people here. The other 4 people only glanced at Zhuo indifferently. When they discovered that Zhuo was only a void sky 7th step cultivator, they looked away without interest and ignored him. The beautiful man was still waving his folding fan. The moment he saw Zhuo behind him, a smile appeared on his face. He walked forward and smiled at Zhuo. "Brother Zhuo, you're really extraordinary. You can actually cross the space law area so quickly. Brother Yao, you flatter me. If we're talking about speed, Brother Yao is much faster than me," Zhuo said with a smile. The beautiful man in front of him was none other than Yao Xiangjuan, whom Zhuo had met in the quicksand family. Yao Xiangjuan shook his head and said, "Brother Zhuo, you're too modest. I'm not much faster than you." "Right, where's Miss Zhu Rui?" Zhuo suddenly asked. Yao Xiangjuan was startled, and then he smiled and said, "That little girl Zhu Rui's strength isn't enough, so I found a relatively safe space in the space law area and let her cultivate there in peace. After I leave, I'll take her with me." Hearing this, Zhuo nodded, and then his gaze fell on the 4 people in front of the divine river of time. He said, "Why are the 5 of you sitting on the banks of the divine river of time? Could it be that you're waiting for something?" Besides Yao Xiangjuan's cultivation, which Zhuo couldn't see through, he discovered that the other 4 people's cultivation wasn't bad. Among them, the 2 white-robed old men were at the late stage of the void sky 8th step, and the couple's strength was slightly weaker. The man was at the late stage of the void sky 8th step, and the woman was at the intermediate stage of the void sky 7th step. Even in the outside world, the strength of these 4 people could be considered supreme powerhouses. Now, they were actually sitting on the banks of the river. Obviously, they were waiting for something. Yao Xiangjuan smiled and said, "The divine river of time is about to recede, and that means that the time crystal will appear. Brother Zhuo, what do you think we're waiting for?" Zhuo's pupils shrank, and his gaze fell on the divine river of time. No wonder Yao Xiangjuan and the other 4 people were waiting on the banks of the river. It turned out that the time crystal contained in the river was about to recede. At that time, the time crystal contained in the river would appear. The time crystal was similar to the space crystal, but it was more precious and rarer than the space crystal. The time crystal was also a top-notch refining material. If the time crystal was refined into a divine artifact, the divine artifact would have a slight effect of freezing time. Just think about it, if your divine artifact had the ability to stop time, even if it was only for an instant, it could absolutely help you turn the situation around at a critical moment. Brother Zhuo, I know that your strength is not bad, but the other 4 people are not simple either. After the divine river of time recede, how about you and I join forces to seize the time crystal? Yarou Xiangjuan suddenly transmitted his voice to Zhuowen. Zhuowen was startled. Then, he glanced at Yarou Xiangjuan. After pondering for a moment, he nodded and said, "Okay, but I want 60% of the time crystal." Yarou Xiangjuan was taken aback. Then, he smiled and said, "Then it's a deal. With Brother Zhuo's strength, even if I only get 40%, it's still a profit." Zhuowen looked at Yarou Xiangjuan in surprise. This guy seemed to be very confident in him. Could it be that this Yarou Xiangjuan really thought that he, Zhuowen, was invincible in the world? By the way, Brother Yao, I met your sister Yarou Xiangjuan in the space law area. I heard that she snuck out. Is that true? Zhuowen stared straight at Yarou Xiangjuan and suddenly asked. Yarou Xiangjuan was a little surprised. Then, he became quite angry and said hatefully, "That little girl really snuck out. I already warned her not to run around, but she still didn't listen." Speaking up to here, Yarou Xiangjuan cupped his fists at Zhuowen and said, "Brother Zhuo, where is your sister now? Can you give me an address?" Zhuowen shook his head and said, "I can't give you the specific address. Moreover, the last time I saw your sister was a few months ago. I don't know where she went after that." Yarou Xiangjuan looked disappointed and sighed, "It's my fault for not disciplining her well." "Brother Zhuo, your sister didn't cause you any trouble, did she?" "No, I don't think your sister is a simple person. It's relatively safe in the river of time and space. It won't be too late for Brother Yarou to find your sister after you leave the river of time and space," Zhuowen said with a smile. "That's the only way," Yarou Xiangjuan said helplessly. Whoosh! Suddenly, the ear-piercing sound of water was heard. Immediately, the river of time in front of them began to surge violently and then began to recede. The water level of the river of time on the shore kept falling and began to expose the riverbed below. Although the river water had not completely receded, Zhuowen had already seen the sparkling and translucent crystals below the riverbed through the river water. He knew that these should be time crystals. Not only Zhuowen, but Yarou Xiangjuan, the 2 white-robed elders, and the pair of Dao companions also stood up and looked at the time crystal that was about to be exposed with burning gazes. Whoosh! The sound of water was heard again. This time, the water on the shore of the river of time finally receded completely, revealing the riverbed that was several feet wide. "Brother Zhuo, snatch it." The moment the riverbed was completely exposed, Yarou Xiangjuan sent a message to Zhuowen with his mind. Then, his figure shot towards the riverbed at lightning speed. Chapter 2309. Zhuowen naturally rushed out immediately. The moment he rushed out, Zhuowen released his divine sense and immediately swept up many time crystals. What a powerful divine sense! Yarou Xiangjuan's pupils shrank. He naturally noticed that Zhuowen had used his divine sense to sweep away many time crystals. Moreover, this sweep was much more than what they had. The other 4 people also noticed Zhuowen. Although the 4 of them were angry that Zhuowen, a mere Void Sky 7 steps ant, had swept away so many time crystals, they did not attack him. However, they did not attack Zhuowen. There were quite a number of time crystals here. They did not want to delay the opportunity to collect them because of such a small matter. After 10 breaths, the 6 people had plundered all the time crystals in the exposed riverbed at the edge of the divine river of time. As Zhuowen's divine sense was much stronger than the other 5 people's, he alone had obtained 1/3 of the total number of time crystals, far more than the other 5 people. Yarou Xiangjuan came to Zhuowen's side and stared at the 2 white-robed elders and the couple in front of him vigilantly. He knew that the fight for the time crystals was far from over. Sure enough, after the other 4 people finished snatching the time crystals, their cold gazes landed on Zhuowen. One of the white-robed elders looked at Zhuowen sinisterly and said, "Little guy, hand over all the time crystals on you and get out of here immediately. Wei Hua, aren't you too merciful? Just kill this kid. Not only will the time crystals he snatched be ours, but this guy's spirit ring will also be ours." Another elder licked his lips and stared straight at Zhuowen like a hungry wolf staring at its prey. The pair of Dao companions stood silently at the side. Amongst the 6 of them, the combination of the 2 white-robed old men was undoubtedly the strongest. Although the couple also coveted the time crystals that Zhuowen had snatched, they did not want to go against the 2 white-robed elders. Therefore, they only planned to watch the show from the side. Brother Zhuo, these 2 old guys are not easy to deal with. Moreover, these 2 old guys are proficient in combination techniques. We might be at a disadvantage if we go against them. Why don't we retreat? I have 2 escape talismans on me that are enough to help us escape, Yarou Shangjuan suggested. Although Zhuowen had killed 3 temple guardians before entering the river of spacetime quicksand, and one of them was a late-stage Void Sky 8 steps expert. However, although the 2 white-robed elders in front of him were also late-stage Void Sky 8 steps, each of them was stronger than the temple guardian. In addition, the 2 cooperated well and were proficient in combination techniques. He did not think that they had much of a chance of winning against these 2 white-robed elders. Brother Yao, don't worry, I'll take care of these 2 people. If you feel that it's inappropriate, you can leave first, Zhuowen said coolly. Yarou Shangjuan was stunned. He looked at Zhuowen's back with a complicated expression. He did not know where this young man got his confidence from. He actually dared to take on 2 people by himself. However, Yarou Shangjuan did not leave. Instead, he stood side by side with Zhuowen and said, Brother Zhuo, since we are allies now, I have no intention of abandoning you. Since you want to fight, I'll accompany you. Zhuowen nodded. He had a better impression of Yarou Shangjuan in his heart. Yarou Shangjuan had considered his feelings at all times. This was something that Zhuowen appreciated. Humph. Let's go. They are just 2 little guys who smell like milk. Wei Hua, let's kill them together. The tall white-robed elder snorted coldly. He took the lead and rushed towards Zhuowen. A trident had appeared in his hand at an unknown time. The moment the tall white-robed elder rushed out, the elder named Wei Hua also rushed out and rushed towards Yarou Shangjuan. Zhuowen drew his king's sword and slashed out, engaging in a fierce battle with the tall old man. This tall elder's strength was indeed stronger than the temple guardian from before. However, Zhuowen had already advanced to the Void Sky 7th step. His strength was much stronger than before. To put it bluntly, Zhuowen did not even need to use phagocytosis to kill this tall elder. However, Zhuowen did not use his killing move. His attention fell on Yarou Shangjuan, who was not far away. This Yarou Shangjuan was quite mysterious. In addition, he had never been able to see through Yarou Shangjuan's cultivation. This made Zhuowen very curious as to whether Yarou Shangjuan was a match for Wei Hua. At the same time, he would be able to understand more about Yarou Shangjuan. Moreover, he knew from Zhou Wendong that Zhu Rui was a disciple of the 6 Desires Palace. Since Yarou Shangjuan was Zhu Rui's senior brother, he was probably also a disciple of the 6 Desires Palace. Bang! 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 Yarou Shangjuan instantly clashed with Wei Hua. Yarou Shangjuan's weapon was a divine sword that emitted an azure light. Moreover, Zhuowen found that the divine sword style was a little feminine. However, when he thought of Yarou Shangjuan's face that was even more beautiful than a woman's, it was not strange for him to have a feminine divine weapon. Wei Hua's cultivation was at the late stage of the Void Sky 8th step. His strength was not weaker than the tall elder fighting Zhuowen. However, Yarou Shangjuan dealt with him with ease and did not show any signs of being at a disadvantage. Zhuowen looked deeply at Yarou Shangjuan. He thought that this Yarou Shangjuan was indeed not simple. From Yarou Shangjuan's temperament, he could see that Yarou Shangjuan's cultivation time was not much longer than Zhuowen's. However, he had this kind of battle strength. He could definitely be considered a monster. Where are you looking? You're actually distracted in battle. You're simply courting death. The tall elder who was fighting Zhuowen saw that Zhuowen's attention was on Yarou Shangjuan, who was not far away. He immediately felt that he was being looked down upon. He flew into a rage and mercilessly attacked Zhuowen with the trident in his hand. Bang! 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 In an instant, countless halberd shadows turned into a monstrous sea, setting off waves that were tens of thousands of feet high. Suddenly, Zhuowen was swept in. His Dao companions, who were standing nearby, saw the terrifying halberd moves released by the tall old man, and their expressions changed. The tall elder's move was extremely terrifying. Even if it were the two of them, they might not be able to escape unscathed if they wanted to block this move. The two of them knew that the white-clothed young man was finished. The endless halberd shadows sprinkled down and instantly drowned Zhuowen's figure. However, not long after the halberd shadows drowned Zhuowen, a terrifying sword light suddenly blasted out from the depths of the halberd shadows. Then, the sword light continued to condense and turned into a huge sword dragon that whistled out. It was Zhuowen who had used the 8th move of the Tao of Destruction sword art, Sky-Slashing Sword Dragon. What? This guy? The tall elder looked at this scene with some astonishment. His face quickly turned ugly. He realized that the young man in front of him was not as simple as he seemed on the surface. The young man's strength was far beyond his imagination. Bang! The tall elder suddenly blasted out the trident in his hand and hit the sword dragon. Then, he groaned and retreated dozens of steps before he could barely stabilize himself. Old man, I'm not going to play with you anymore. I'll give you a chance to live. Take this move of mine. Then, you only need to hand over the time crystal and you can leave. Zhuowen held the sword in his right hand and looked down at the tall elder. The killing intent in his eyes was so substantial that it radiated out. Suddenly, the surrounding space was filled with killing intent. Chapter 23:10. Count. The tall old man's eyes flickered. He no longer looked down on the white-clothed young man. Instead, he was afraid of him. Of course, while he was fearful, he wasn't fearful to the point of being afraid of the might of this kid's sword strike. I admit that you're very strong. You must have been hiding your cultivation before. However, even so, it's impossible for you to kill me with one strike, the tall old man sneered. Oh, is that so? From the looks of it, you're very confident that you can withstand my sword. All right then, take a good look at this sword that's going to kill you. What exactly is it like? Zhuowen's eyes were still indifferent. He slowly raised the king's sword and placed it on his right shoulder. Then, he stomped his right foot and disappeared like a ghost. When Zhuowen reappeared, he was already 10 meters in front of the old man. Zhuowen's sword had already slashed down. Rumble. The moment the sword slashed down, the surrounding space began to collapse and collapse. It was as if space had been completely obliterated at that moment. It was the last move of the Destruction Tao sword art. It was also the strongest move, Genesis Splitter. The power of Genesis Splitter was related to space. This time, Zhuowen had completely comprehended the law of space. The power of Genesis Splitter was much stronger than before. The tall old man's face finally changed completely. It was filled with fear, confusion, and regret. The strike was too powerful. The entire space was annihilated. He could not even move his limbs. Moreover, after the space was annihilated, waves of terrifying sword chi dispersed into the annihilated space. Then, all of them blasted into his body and tore his body into pieces. The tall old man took one last look at the sword-wielding young man. The regret in his heart erupted like a volcano. Unfortunately, regret was useless. Zhuowen looked calmly at the tall old man who was annihilated by the sword chi. After comprehending the spatial law, Zhuowen knew that the power of the Destruction Tao sword art's final move, heaven-splitting earth-splitting, would increase a lot. In addition, his cultivation level had advanced to the Void Sky 7th level, so killing a late-stage Void Sky 8th level expert would not be a problem. Of course, Zhuowen would not be as relaxed as he was now if he had reached the peak of the Void Sky 8 ascensions. Not far away, the couple's faces were pale as they involuntarily retreated dozens of steps. Their eyes were filled with fear as they looked at the white-clothed youth who had taken away the old man's spirit ring. Senior. When Zhuowen arrived in front of the couple, the two hurriedly bowed and greeted him. This person was able to easily kill the tall old man, which meant that this person's strength was above the two of them. Even though Zhuowen looked very young, in this world where strength reigned supreme, those who had reached the top would always be first. Hand over the time crystal. I won't make things difficult for you, Zhuowen said calmly. The couple looked at each other and sighed softly. They had no choice but to take out all the time crystals they had just obtained and hand them over to Zhuowen. After taking the time crystals, the couple did not stay here for long. They cupped their fists at Zhuowen and left. Yarou Shengjuan and Wei Hua, who were originally fighting on the side, naturally saw that the battle had ended. Yarou Shengjuan's eyes were calm. He did not find it strange. After all, Zhuowen had already killed a late-stage Void Sky 8th level expert in front of him. It would be strange if that tall old man was Zhuowen's opponent. However, when he saw Zhuowen deal with the tall old man so easily, Yarou Shengjuan was still a little shocked. He remembered that Zhuowen had not killed the Temple Guardian so easily. Zhuowen's strength has increased a little compared to before, Yarou Shengjuan said in his heart. On the other hand, Wei Hua was greatly shocked and had the intention to retreat. Wei Hua roared angrily and suddenly punched out. Then, this punch actually split into thousands of punches in an instant. The punches were like overlapping waves as they fiercely smashed in front of Yarou Shengjuan. Yarou Shengjuan's eyes narrowed. He coldly snorted and slashed out with his sword. Instantly, the sword light turned into an incomparably huge blue whale, blocking the countless punches in front of him. At the same time, the instant Yarou Shengjuan blocked the punches, he took out a handful of talismans from his spirit ring and threw them at Wei Hua without holding back. Every single one of these talismans was not ordinary. They all contained extremely terrifying energy. When a handful of talismans were thrown out, continuous explosions erupted from the talismans. Wei Hua was caught off guard and was enveloped by the explosions. When the explosions gradually subsided, Wei Hua's entire body became pitch black. He was in an exceptionally sorry state. He fell to the ground, spat out a mouthful of blood, and did not get up again. Zhuowen glanced at Wei Hua. He knew that Wei Hua's injuries were too serious. He was afraid that he would not live for long. Although Void Sky cultivators had the Void Sky Bridge and their vitality was extremely tenacious, the talismans thrown out by Yarou Shengjuan were not ordinary. The power of the explosions went deep into the soul. Wei Hua's main injuries were not external, but the depths of his soul. With Zhuowen's powerful divine soul, he naturally could easily detect how serious Wei Hua's injuries were. This was also why he was certain that Wei Hua would die without a doubt. Thinking of this, Zhuowen glanced at Yarou Shengjuan again. This person was indeed not simple. Although Yarou Shengjuan's strength might be on par with Wei Hua during the battle, his trump cards were extremely powerful. Just now, when Yarou Shengjuan threw out so many talismans, even if it was Zhuowen, he would probably be in a sorry state. Of course, he would not die in such a sorry state like Wei Hua. Brother Zhuo, I still underestimated you. I didn't expect you to be so powerful. Yarou Shengjuan put away Wei Hua's spirit ring and came in front of Zhuowen. His eyes were filled with fear and surprise. Zhuowen smiled slightly and said, "It was just luck." Yarou Shengjuan smiled embarrassedly. He naturally did not think that this was really Zhuowen's luck. However, since Zhuowen did not want to talk about this topic, Yarou Shengjuan would not pursue it. Brother Yarou, take this time crystal. I said that we would split it 40 to 60. Zhuowen casually threw a spirit ring to Yarou Shengjuan. The latter caught the spirit ring with slight surprise. He immediately checked it and said, "Brother Zhuo, you really want to split it with me? These were all obtained by you. I am a man of my words. How could I take advantage of you in this matter?" Zhuowen said indifferently. Yarou Shengjuan looked deeply at Zhuowen and smiled. He also took out the time crystal from Wei Hua's spirit ring and threw it to Zhuowen. He said, "This is 60% of the time crystal in Wei Hua's spirit ring. Brother Zhuo, please count it." Zhuowen took the time crystal and nodded. He directly put it into the spirit ring without any intention of counting it. Chapter 23:11. Snatch again. Brother Zhuo, what are your plans? Are you going to leave this place or stay here to comprehend the rules of time? Yarou Shengjuan looked at Zhuo and asked. "I want to cross the divine river of time," Zhuo said in a deep voice. Yarou Shengjuan was shocked, then shook his head and said with a smile, "Brother Zhuo, the divine river of time is too terrifying. Even if you have comprehended the rules of time, The flow of time in the divine river of time is still faster than the outside world. Moreover, we don't know how wide this divine river of time is, so Zhuo smiled and did not answer. Instead, he took out a praying mat and sat cross-legged on the shore. He began to comprehend the rules of time here. This was originally an area of time rules, and the power of time rules was emitted everywhere. Moreover, Zhuo could also feel that the flow of time around him was faster. Clearly, it was because of the rules of time. If the rules of time on the shore were so terrifying, then there was no need to mention the divine river of time. Zhuo did not know anything about the rules of time, so he naturally would not rashly enter the divine river of time. Yarou Xiangjuan looked at Zhuo, who was sitting not far away, and smiled bitterly. He knew that Zhuo had already given him the answer. Yarou Xiangjuan also found a secluded place, took out a praying mat, and sat down cross-legged. His gaze fell on the divine river of time in front of him, and he said in a daze, "Brother Zhuo, could it be that you want to cross the divine river of time for the space-time roulette?" Zhuo's eyelids twitched, but he did not open his eyes. Instead, he fell into silence. Yarou Xiangjuan did not mind, but continued to talk to himself. "I once heard my master say that the most precious thing in the space-time river of quicksand is not the space crystal or the time crystal, but something called the space-time roulette. The speed of the space-time roulette is the fastest in the world. No one can compare to it. Even the top-flight divine tool in the heavenly domain cannot compare to the space-time roulette." Yarou Xiangjuan said. Zhuo's heart stirred, and he was filled with curiosity about the space-time roulette. From Yarou Xiangjuan's tone, Zhuowen could tell that the space-time roulette was a top-notch flying artifact. It could also be said that it was the fastest treasure in all of the heaven domains. However, Zhuowen was somewhat ignorant. He had not come to the river of space-time quicksand for the space-time roulette. Instead, he had come for the space-time key. As for whether the space-time roulette and the space-time key had any definite connection, Zhuowen was not very sure. If he could cross the divine river of time this time, Zhuowen would definitely look for the space-time key first. Then, if he had the chance, he might look for the so-called space-time roulette. Time ticked by. Zhuowen and Yarou Xiangjuan sat on the shore, trying to comprehend the laws of time. 10 years passed in the blink of an eye. During this time, many cultivators came out of the spatial law zone and came to the shore of the divine river of time. As Zhuowen and Yarou Xiangjuan's auras were not weak, most of the cultivators did not deliberately offend Zhuowen and Yarou Xiangjuan. Of course, there were some who offended them, but they were basically dealt with by Xiao He, who was guarding Zhuowen. For a time, the area around Zhuowen and Yarou Xiangjuan became a forbidden area for other cultivators. Most of the cultivators who entered the temporal law zone were there to comprehend the laws of time. Therefore, many cultivators followed Zhuowen and Yarou Xiangjuan's example and sat in this space, silently comprehending the laws of time, hoping to gain something. Among them, there were also some impatient cultivators who knew that there were good things like time crystals in the divine river of time. They could not suppress the greed in their hearts and entered the divine river of time. In the end, the moment these cultivators entered the divine river of time, their hair turned white, their skin became dry like tree bark, and their vitality was constantly washed away by the waves of the divine river of time. In the end, they died of old age in the divine river of time. Such an outcome was like a basin of cold water that was poured over most of the cultivators' heads. These cultivators no longer had any wishful thinking in their hearts. Instead, they obediently comprehended the laws of time first. The divine river of time would ebb and flow once every 10 years. It had been 10 years since the last ebb, and the second ebb was about to begin. At this moment, Zhuowen slowly opened his eyes. His eyes flickered with a bright light. In the past 10 years, he had been comprehending the laws of time all the time. He was not stingy in using up all the time crystals he had obtained. He also had a certain understanding and comprehension of the laws of time. Not enough. Zhuowen's eyes flickered. His gaze fell on the divine river of time in front of him again. He knew that the divine river of time was about to ebb again. Every time it ebbed, many time crystals would appear on the riverbed on the shore. If he wanted to quickly comprehend the laws of time, he could only rely on time crystals. Although Zhuowen had gained a lot in the past 10 years, He knew that his comprehension of the laws of time was still superficial. If he wanted to have a deeper understanding, he would need enough time crystals and sufficient time. Yarou Xiangjuan also opened his eyes. He glanced at Zhuowen and saw the latter nodding and smiling slightly. He also knew what Zhuowen meant. Whoosh! The waves on the shore of the divine river of time suddenly surged. Then, the water level on the shore was falling, revealing a part of the sparkling and translucent time crystals. As the water level continued to fall, more and more time crystals were exposed. Whoosh! 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 Before the water level had completely receded, many cultivators on the shore could not hold back and rushed out to snatch the exposed time crystals. Zhuowen and Yarou Xiangjuan were no exception. Zhuowen's divine sense gushed out and turned into a big hand. In an instant, many time crystals were swept away. His speed was far faster than other cultivators. When the water level completely fell, the riverbed finally appeared in front of everyone. Everyone went crazy. Some cultivators even started to fight in order to snatch the time crystals. The scene became extremely chaotic. Zhuowen did not care about those cultivators who were fighting at all. Instead, he focused on grabbing the time crystals and collecting as many time crystals as he could. After a while, the time crystals on the exposed riverbed were basically all plundered. Apart from the bare riverbed, there were no more time crystals. As for Zhuowen, he had snatched more than half of the time crystals. Although Yarou Xiangjuan could not compare to Zhuowen in terms of the number of time crystals he had snatched, it was still quite a number. At the very least, Yarou Xiangjuan was quite satisfied. The rest of the time crystals were basically divided among other cultivators. However, the general situation was that there were too many monks and too little gruel. There was also a large number of cultivators who did not get a single time crystal at all. Chapter 23:12. Spacetime Relachuan could not be bothered with those cultivators who were still arguing endlessly. He planned to find a secluded place and go into seclusion to comprehend the time rule again. He had a feeling that with so many time crystals, he would definitely gain quite a bit in terms of time rule. However, just as Zhuowen left the riverbed and arrived at the shore, he was intercepted by a group of people. This group of people had a total of over 20 people, and the person in the lead was a man with an arrogant expression. The aura on this man's body was vast. He was actually also a void sky 7th step powerhouse. "What's the matter?" Zhuowen said indifferently. "This brother, I saw that you acted extraordinarily just now and took away more than half of the time crystals. Brother, don't you think that you're too greedy? You alone took more than half of the time crystals." The arrogant man said indifferently. Zhuowen's gaze was indifferent as he glanced at the arrogant man and the 20 over people behind him, sneering coldly in his heart. Without needing to think, he also knew why these 20 over people were here. However, Zhuowen did not want to get entangled with these people, and said coldly, "If you don't want to die, scram. These time crystals are ownerless to begin with. Whoever gets them will get them. It's my ability that I can get more than half of them. If you have the ability, go and snatch so many time crystals too." The arrogant man's face immediately darkened, and the 20 over people behind him also revealed looks of anger. "You're still in the right to take so many time crystals by yourself. Everyone discovered the time crystals. Since you took so many, you should take them out and share them equally with everyone." "That's right. What right do you have to take so many time crystals?" The 20 over people behind the arrogant man immediately clamored and blocked in front of Zhuowen, not having the slightest intention of letting him pass. The arrogant man's mouth revealed a mocking smile, and he said indifferently, "Brother, you see that everyone's voice is very loud. I think you should comply with the public opinion and take out the time crystals. Of course, you only need to take out 2/3 of the time crystals on you. Then you can keep the rest for yourself. How about it?" Zhuowen couldn't be bothered to talk nonsense with this arrogant man. He opened his hand and slammed it towards the arrogant man's face. The haughty man's eyes darkened. His divine power suddenly erupted, wanting to block Zhuowen's palm. But soon, the arrogant man's expression changed. He found that he couldn't move. "Spatial rule power? You've completely comprehended the spatial laws. How can he be so strong? The arrogant man's expression changed greatly. Unfortunately, just as he finished speaking, Zhuowen's palm ruthlessly slapped his face. Poochie. The arrogant man spat out a mouthful of blood mixed with broken teeth. Then, he rolled a few times in the air before crashing to the ground in a sorry state. You crippled me. The arrogant man raised his head with difficulty and glared at Zhuowen with resentment. Then, he fell to the ground and completely lost consciousness. The remaining 20 or so people were stunned on the spot. Their bodies trembled as they looked at the white-clothed young man in front of them. Then, they dispersed in an uproar. The arrogant man was the strongest among them, but he was knocked to the ground by the white-clothed young man with a single slap. They weren't fools. They knew that the white-clothed young man in front of them was far stronger than them. Zhuowen looked at this group of people silently. He didn't chase after them. Instead, he left this place. Although one needed to comprehend the spatial laws to enter the spatial laws area, generally speaking, one only needed to comprehend a part of the spatial laws to leave the spatial laws area. Therefore, most of the cultivators who entered the spatial laws area had only comprehended a part of the spatial laws. However, Zhuowen was different. He had completely comprehended the spatial laws. He was much stronger than the arrogant man and the others. In addition, the arrogant man was only 7 steps in the void sky. Zhuowen used the spatial laws to easily imprison the arrogant man on the spot, making him unable to move. The battle on Zhuowen's side naturally attracted the attention of many cultivators around. Especially after seeing Zhuowen cripple the arrogant man with 7 steps in the void sky in one move, the cultivators who originally wanted to play tricks all gave up. This was a ruthless person. They didn't want to end up like that arrogant man. Yaro Xiangjuan followed behind Zhuowen. He wasn't surprised that Zhuowen made a move. After spending some time together, Yaro Xiangjuan had more or less figured out Zhuowen's character. Zhuowen was a very principled person. If others didn't offend him, he wouldn't offend them. If others offended him, he would definitely bite back. This kind of person couldn't be offended the most. Once offended, if this person couldn't be eliminated immediately, it would become an endless disaster in the future. In a valley far away from the divine river of time, Zhuowen found a cave in the surroundings. Seeing Yaro Xiangjuan follow him in, Zhuowen was speechless. Brother Yaro, there are many caves in this valley. Why do you have to squeeze into a cave with me? Yaro Xiangjuan smiled faintly. His smile had a rare trace of charm. When Zhuowen saw this smile, he actually became absent-minded for a moment. Although Yaro Xiangjuan was a man, he had a face that was more beautiful than a woman's. If Yaro Xiangjuan wore women's clothes, no one would think that he was a man dressed as a woman. After regaining his senses, Zhuowen deliberately looked at the Adam's apple on Yaro Xiangjuan's neck. After confirming that Yaro Xiangjuan was indeed a man, he was relieved. Yaro Xiangjuan also noticed Zhuowen's small movements. He frowned slightly, but didn't say anything. Instead, he smiled and said, "Brother Zhuowen, don't worry. I won't disturb Brother Zhuo. Moreover, the two of us can take care of each other while cultivating." Zhuowen shrugged and didn't say anything. He took out a praying mat, sat down cross-legged, and continued to comprehend the time law. Yaro Xiangjuan raised his eyebrows and didn't say anything. Instead, he sat cross-legged not far away, silently cultivating and comprehending the time law. 5 years quietly passed. Zhuo Wen, who was sitting cross-legged on the praying mat, suddenly stood up. Then, he threw out a punch. Instantly, the rock wall that his fist passed through became riddled with holes as if it had been eroded by the wind. Zhuowen knew that this was the mark of the passage of time. Only after hundreds or thousands of years of weathering would a rock become riddled with holes. Yaro Xiangjuan also sensed the commotion on this side. He looked at the stone wall that was riddled with holes next to Zhuo Wen and revealed a shocked expression. "Brother Zhuo, you have completely comprehended the laws of time?" Zhuo Wen shook his head and said, "The temporal laws aren't that easy to comprehend. However, I've gained quite a bit of a grasp of the temporal laws. At the very least, I'm much more confident in traversing the river of time now." Yaro Xiangjuan had a complicated look in his eyes. There was no doubt that Zhuowen's comprehension ability was stronger than his. Over the past 15 years, Yarou Shengjuan had been diligently comprehending the time law. Although he had made some progress in the time law, he couldn't compare with Zhuowen. At least, Yarou Shengjuan was far from reaching the point where he could cross the time river alone. Thinking of this, Yarou Shengjuan's eyes flickered. He gritted his teeth and said, "Brother Zhuo, can you help me cross the time river?" Zhuowen looked at Yarou Shengjuan in surprise. Just when he was about to refuse, Yarou Shengjuan said again, "If you can help me cross the time river, I can provide you with clues about the space-time roulette." Zhuowen narrowed his eyes and took a deep look at Yarou Shengjuan. It seemed that Yarou Shengjuan was hiding a lot of things from him. At least, he didn't think that Yarou Shengjuan was interested in the space-time roulette. Chapter 23:13. Entering the Divine River of Time. Brother Yarou, since you've told me all the clues about the space-time roulette, you might not be able to beat me when you enter the Divine River of Time, Zhuowen said with a smile. Yarou Shengjuan didn't seem to mind and said, "Brother Zhuo, you probably don't know that the space-time roulette is a flying treasure. As far as I know, there are no other flying divine weapons that can compare to the space-time roulette," but, at this point, Yarou Shengjuan fell silent. However, Zhuowen had other thoughts in his mind. If the space-time roulette was really so magical, the true experts of the Six Desires Heavenly Palace should also enter the river of time and space to search for treasures. However, as far as Zhuowen was concerned, the strongest experts who had entered the river of time and space were the two white-robed elders. Their cultivations were only at the late stage of the Void Sky 8th step. He hadn't even seen an expert at the peak of the Void Sky 8th step. Obviously, this so-called space-time roulette might have some flaws, or it might just be a rumor. "Brother Yarou, feel free to say what you want to say," Zhuowen said with a smile. "It's actually like this. When the space-time roulette first appeared in the space-time quicksand river, it caused several Void Sky 9th Ascension experts to fight over it. Even the Palace Master of Six Desires Palace took action. In the end, the space-time roulette was shattered by these experts," Yarou Shengjuan said with some embarrassment. Zhuowen's gaze suddenly became extremely strange. He didn't deny that the space-time roulette was a flying treasure, but a flying treasure that was shattered into pieces was equivalent to having no value at all. "Brother Zhuo, you may not know that the two core components of the space-time roulette are actually the space-time cores. Each space-time core contains extremely rich space-time power. If the space-time core is placed on a flying divine weapon, its speed may not surpass that of the space-time roulette, but it's at least much faster than most flying divine weapons." Yarou Shengjuan took a deep breath and said with a slightly blazing gaze. Zhuowen took a deep look at Yarou Shengjuan. If what Yarou Shengjuan said was true, then the holospace would be very useful. Although Zhuowen had several flying divine artifacts, they weren't very fast. They weren't even as fast as Zhuowen's speed if he went all out. Therefore, Zhuowen still wanted an extremely fast flying artifact from the bottom of his heart, and the space-time roulette obviously met the requirements in Zhuowen's heart. However, since the space-time roulette had already been shattered, he could only settle for the next best thing, which was to obtain the space-time holospace. After a moment of silence, Zhuowen said, "Brother Yarou, if what you said is true, I can bring you across the divine river of time. However, I cannot guarantee your safety." However, Yarou Shengjuan smiled and said, "It's fine. As long as Brother Zhuo can bring me across the divine river of time, it's fine. Let's go then." Zhuowen nodded and left the cave first. However, not long after Zhuowen left the cave, a black shadow suddenly rushed out from another cave in the valley and landed beside Zhuowen. This black shadow was a rather handsome young man. His face was very similar to Zhuowen's. He was dressed in a black robe and was Zhuowen's clone. Zhuowen had stayed in the time rule area for 15 years. During these 15 years, Zhuowen had basically released the black-robed Zhuowen and let him absorb the calamity crystals and cultivate on his own. Although the black-robed Zhuowen's speed of passing through the wind disasters was much slower than before, he had still passed through 5 wind disasters in the past 15 years. Including the first wind disaster, Zhuowen had passed through a total of 6 wind disasters. Just as Zhuowen had studied before, except for the first wind disaster that was more terrifying, the next 5 wind disasters were not as powerful as the first one. Therefore, the black-robed Zhuowen had passed through the wind disasters quite easily. Of course, Zhuowen also knew that when he passed through the 8th wind disaster and welcomed the 9th wind disaster, that would be the real challenge. The 9th wind disaster was the second hurdle, and its power was probably even more terrifying than the first wind disaster. For this reason, Zhuowen had made a lot of preparations in advance. If he was not very confident, he would not take the risk to try the 9th wind disaster. Yarou Xiangjuan, who was following behind, stole a glance at the black-robed Zhuowen, and his eyes revealed a hint of fear. As early as when he was with Zhuowen, he knew that Zhuowen had a clone. What surprised him even more was that this clone of Zhuowen gave him a much stronger sense of crisis than the main body. Yarou Xiangjuan knew what this meant. Obviously, Zhuowen's clone was stronger than the main body, and this clone was undoubtedly Zhuowen's final trump card. Thinking of this, Yarou Xiangjuan became even more fearful of Zhuowen. He felt that this white-robed young man in front of him was really unfathomable. When he came to the shore of the Divine River of Time again, Zhuowen found that the number of people on the shore of the Divine River of Time had doubled. Cultivators could be seen sitting cross-legged on the shore, comprehending the laws of time. Of course, there were also a small number of cultivators who were arguing and fighting not far away. Divine power surged and boiled, and it was quite a spectacular sight. Zhuowen's arrival immediately attracted the attention of many cultivators on the shore. Many of them revealed a hint of fear in their eyes. Obviously, they recognized Zhuowen. Back then, the matter of Zhuowen crippling the arrogant man with a single slap had spread like wildfire after Zhuowen had left. Wherever Zhuowen passed, the surrounding cultivators would involuntarily make way for him. There were also some new cultivators who didn't know Zhuowen. When they saw the reverence in the other cultivators' eyes, their eyes revealed surprise and doubt. Of course, there would usually be people who would remind these newcomers of the identity of this seemingly harmless young man who was walking over. The new cultivators also revealed looks of fear. Zhuowen didn't care about the reverent gazes of the surrounding cultivators at all. He walked straight to the shore and stopped. What is this person trying to do? Could it be that he wants to enter the Divine River of Time? How is that possible? It's not like you don't know how terrifying the Divine River of Time is. This person wouldn't be so stupid as to go in and die. Discussions rang out one after another, all of them discussing Zhuowen's current actions. Zhuowen's next action completely shocked everyone around. Zhuowen took a step forward and jumped into the Divine River of Time. Yarou Xiangjuan, who was following behind Zhuowen, didn't hesitate and jumped into the Divine River of Time with Zhuowen. The moment Zhuowen entered the Divine River of Time, Zhuowen could clearly feel that the flow of time was speeding up. Moreover, it was rapidly accelerating, and his vitality was rapidly depleting as time passed. Chapter 23:14. Crossing. Zhuowen frowned slightly and raised his hands. The rule of time gushed out from his hands. Suddenly, the influence of the Divine River of Time on Zhuowen became much smaller, and Zhuowen's withered hands gradually returned to their original state. On the other hand, Yarou Xiangjuan was desperately resisting the erosion of the rule of time the moment he entered the Divine River of Time. At this moment, he was staggering, his face was pale, and the tips of his hair had turned white. It was obvious that his level up was passing very quickly. Zhuowen grabbed Yarou Xiangjuan's right hand with one hand and immediately lifted Yarou Xiangjuan up by the waist with the other hand. Yarou Xiangjuan was almost entangled by the Divine River of Time and could not move at all. Zhuowen could only rely on this method to lift Yarou Xiangjuan up. The moment Yarou Xiangjuan was lifted up by Zhuowen, he could not help but exclaim. Then, he began to struggle, as if he was not used to the feeling of being hugged by others. "Brother Yarou, if you don't want to die, you'd better not move," Zhuowen said in a deep voice. Yarou Xiangjuan's body stiffened. In the end, he did not struggle anymore. Instead, he lay meekly on Zhuowen's chest, but his cheeks were as red as an apple. Zhuowen's gaze was a little strange. It was the first time he had hugged a man, and a man as beautiful as a woman. Of course, this was also a helpless action. After all, the rule of time in the Divine River of Time was too strong, and Zhuowen had not completely comprehended the rule of time. If the two of them were not close, Zhuowen would not be able to protect Yarou Shangjuan. Yarou Shangjuan had obviously guessed Zhuowen's thoughts. Although his body was slightly unnatural, he did not say anything. However, what surprised Zhuowen was that Yarou Shangjuan's body was so soft that it was as if there were no bones. He was even softer than an ordinary woman. Zhuowen, who was hugging Yarou Shangjuan, did not feel that he was hugging a man at all. Instead, it felt more like a woman. "Brother Zhuo, let's go," Yarou Shangjuan gently reminded. Zhuowen recovered and nodded. He took a step forward with his right foot and the space under his feet was immediately compressed. He took a step forward and instantly turned into a black dot in the distance. Countless cultivators on the banks of the divine river of time were stunned as they watched the two of them leave in an instant. These cultivators had personally experienced just how terrifying the divine river of time was. In the past, many cultivators had attempted to cross the divine river of time. However, they either died of old age upon entering the divine river of time or were drowned by the waves of time. Anyway, no one had walked more than 100 miles in the divine river of time. However, Zhuowen's speed was too terrifying. He disappeared in front of their eyes in an instant. It was more than 100 miles. It was more than 1,000 miles, or even 10,000 miles. After taking 10 steps in a row, powerful spatial rules lingered around Zhuowen's body. Zhuowen could no longer see the shore of the divine river of time. All around him were grey waves of time. Zhuowen's eyes became extremely solemn. He had thoroughly comprehended the spatial rules. The distance he covered with 10 steps was at least 10 million miles. However, he didn't walk out of the divine river of time. Instead, he came to the endless waves of time. Zhuowen knew that the span of the divine river of time was even longer than he had imagined. Moreover, the spatial rules here seemed to be substantial. They densely covered the place and turned into various terrifying attacks. They swept over and bombarded Zhuowen's body. The attacks formed by the spatial rules were exceptionally terrifying. They were enough to kill any cultivator below the void sky 9th step. Even if it was Zhuowen, if he had not grasped the time law to the point of great mastery, he would definitely die here. Of course, although Zhuowen blocked the attacks of the spatial rules around him, he obviously didn't have it easy. The surface of Zhuowen's skin and hair began to age. His eyes began to turn turbid, and his back became hunched. At this moment, Zhuowen's youthful appearance turned into an old man of about 50 years old. This was the influence of the spatial rules. Zhuowen knew that if he didn't walk out of the divine river of time as soon as possible, he would continue to age until he died. Yarou Shangjuan curled up in Zhuowen's arms. He obviously noticed Zhuowen's strange state. His gaze changed drastically, and he said, "Brother Zhuowen, are you okay? Don't talk." "I'm fine," Zhuowen said in a low voice. He took another step forward. The spatial rules and temporal rules were used to the extreme. Yarou Shangjuan naturally didn't dare to say anything. However, he was rather worried about Zhuowen. Seeing that Zhuowen was beginning to age, he felt rather guilty. If Zhuowen didn't want to bring him along, he knew that with Zhuowen's strength, he should be able to cross the divine river of time very quickly. Zhuowen took another 10 steps. His hair was completely white, and his appearance was that of a 70-year-old old man. However, he still couldn't cross the divine river of time. He was still surrounded by grey waves of time. "Brother Zhuo, put me down. I should be the one dragging you down this time. I didn't expect the divine river of time to be so terrifying. I miscalculated." Yarou Shangjuan sighed softly. Zhuowen didn't care. Instead, he kept moving forward like a demon. Although his body was constantly aging, his eyes became brighter and brighter, like the most resplendent stars in the night sky. Being in the divine river of time and experiencing the terror of the temporal rules in the divine river of time, Zhuowen had a deeper understanding of the temporal rules. Outside the divine river of time, Zhuowen had a deep understanding of the temporal rules with the help of time crystals and had reached the level of great success. However, no matter how rich the temporal rules in the outside world were, they couldn't be compared to the temporal rules in the divine river of time. More than 90% of the temporal rules in the temporal rule area were gathered in the divine river of time. The divine river of time was the best place to comprehend the temporal rules. However, the temporal rules in the divine river of time were too powerful. Therefore, ordinary cultivators didn't dare to comprehend the temporal rules in the divine river of time. It was too late for them to escape. Zhuo already had a certain level of understanding of the time law. Now that he was deep in the divine river of time, he had personally experienced the terrifying power of the time law in the divine river of time. Hence, he naturally understood some of the minor details of the time law. I understand. The temporal rules in the divine river of time have been restraining me, making me go in circles, Zhuo murmured in a low voice. He glanced at the grey waves of time around him. The waves of time here were almost exactly the same as the waves of time when he first came here. In other words, the divine river of time had reversed the flow of time. No matter how many steps Zhuo took forward, even if he exerted the spatial rules to the extreme, it would be useless. He would be reversed by the divine river of time to the place where he first came to Zhuo. If Zhuo wanted to step out of the divine river of time, the first thing he had to do was break the reversal of time. When Yarou Shangjuan saw Zhuo's enlightened expression, he immediately remained silent for fear of disturbing Zhuo. Boom! Zhuo took a deep breath and then suddenly punched out. His fist was wrapped in grey energy. The grey energy looked extremely strange. This punch actually had a charm that could take one's soul away. And this charm seemed to be able to last forever, forever staying still in time. Bang! The fist contained a powerful rule of time. With one punch, the surrounding waves of time were all shattered. Like broken glass, they shattered into pieces. Chapter 23:15. Necklace. Boom. 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 Zhuo moved forward while throwing out punches with his right fist. His left hand hugged Yarou Shangjuan as he moved forward. Waves of time surged toward Zhuo like angry dragons. They seemed to want to envelop Zhuo and turn him into dust. Unfortunately, Zhuo had finally comprehended the rules of time after being lost. With a punch, the waves of time were basically broken by Zhuo. Zhuo punched with every step he took. After taking 5 steps, he finally stepped onto the ground. Putting down Yarou Shangjuan, Zhuo turned around and looked at the endless river of time behind him. He sighed softly in his heart. His entire body went limp on the ground, powerless. Fortunately, Yarou Shangjuan was quick to react. He grabbed Zhuo's arms with both hands and tried to straighten him up. Unfortunately, Yarou Shangjuan was also deeply affected by the river of time. His actual situation was not much different from Zhuo's. The moment Yarou Shangjuan grabbed Zhuo, he knew something was wrong. Then, Zhuo fell toward him. Yarou Shangjuan was powerless. He could only watch as Zhuo fell and pressed him to the ground. Go! At this moment, Yarou Shangjuan's cheeks were as red as a ripe apple. He was powerless and had no strength to move Zhuo away. However, when he saw Zhuo's white hair and fainted, Yarou Shangjuan gradually calmed down. He reached out and gently stroked Zhuo's white hair. His gaze was complicated and moved. Yarou Shangjuan knew very well that if Zhuo were to cross the river of time alone, he would not be in such a sorry state. But this time, he brought him along, which made it more difficult for Zhuo to cross the river of time. What Yarou Shangjuan couldn't forget was that in the desperate situation of the divine river of time, he had originally planned to ask Zhuo to abandon him and cross the divine river of time alone. However, Zhuo had asked him to shut up and continue advancing on the divine river of time. At that moment, Zhuo's figure could no longer be erased from Yarou Shangjuan's mind. After resting for a while, the feeling of weakness in Yarou Shangjuan's body lessened a lot. He immediately moved, but just as he started to move, with a red face, Yarou Shangjuan gently released Zhuo's hands and laid Zhuo's body on the ground. Only then did he slowly stand up. At this moment, Yarou Shangjuan's long hair was completely scattered. Her beautiful face and messy long hair gave her a delicate appearance. Fortunately, this Zhuo has fainted. Otherwise, we might have been exposed. Moreover, after taking off the crystal necklace, Yarou Shangjuan's face became even more beautiful and enchanting. This was a kind of suffocating beauty. If others were to see such a face, they might really suffocate. It was simply too beautiful. Yarou Shangjuan gently pulled up her hair, then took out a small comb and gently combed her beautiful hair. After washing up, Yarou Shangjuan's beautiful eyes fell on Zhuowen. Brother Zhuo, thank you for helping me cross the river of time. Actually, I lied to you. Although there are two space-time heart, the clue I provided was actually only one space-time heart. Yarou Shangjuan sighed softly. Then, she took off the crystal necklace from her neck and put it on Zhuowen's neck. This crystal necklace had an extremely obscure concealment ability. Relying on this crystal necklace, Yarou Shangjuan had never let outsiders see that he was actually a woman. Even the strongest of the Void Sky 9 steps might not be able to tell that Yarou Shangjuan's true identity was actually a woman. And the reason why Yarou Shangjuan's cultivation was so obscure naturally had a lot to do with this crystal necklace. Of course, Yarou Shangjuan knew that in addition to having an extremely powerful concealment ability, her necklace also had an even more important function. This was because this crystal necklace contained an extremely powerful life source. And this powerful life source was enough to allow Yarou Shangjuan to escape a fatal crisis. It could be said that it was Yarou Shangjuan's most important life-saving item. The space-time heart is very important to me. Brother Zhuo, don't blame me for deceiving you. I am a person who doesn't like to owe others favors, but this time, I owe you a huge favor. At present, I have no way to repay this favor. Take this life heart as a reward for your favor. At this point, Yarou Shangjuan gently put the crystal necklace on Zhuowen's neck. Then, the green light in the crystal poured into Zhuowen's chest. This green light contained an extremely rich life force. As this green light poured into Zhuowen's body, the latter's withered skin began to moisten, and his white hair began to turn black. Zhuowen's originally weak aura was like a dry land that had been moistened by rain and dew, gradually becoming stronger. Yarou Shangjuan looked at Zhuowen, whose aura was gradually growing stronger, and let out a light breath. Then, she looked at Zhuowen's side, stomped her right foot, and completely disappeared from where she was, rushing forward. Zhuowen's eyelids slowly trembled, and then he opened them. Zhuowen sat up, looked around blankly, and muttered in a low voice, "I fainted." But soon, Zhuowen noticed that there was an extremely strong life force in his chest, which was pouring into his body, causing a comfortable feeling to rise up from his body. What is this? Zhuowen held up the crystal necklace in front of his chest with his right hand, looked at the crystal necklace in his palm with bright eyes, and said in surprise, "What a powerful life force, what exactly is this necklace?" Zhuowen's eyes revealed a look of surprise. The life force that emerged from this crystal necklace was simply something he had never seen before in his life. Needless to say, Zhuowen knew that this crystal necklace was absolutely priceless. Chapter 23:16. Beauty is poisonous. Did Brother Yarou give this to me? Zhuowen thought of something and wanted to look for Yarou Shangjuan, but he found that there was no one around. Zhuowen frowned. He was sure that Yarou Shangjuan had given him the crystal necklace, but where did Yarou Shangjuan go after leaving the necklace behind? Yarou Shangjuan still had the clue to the space-time hollow. Now that Yarou Shangjuan had disappeared, it meant that the clue to the space-time hollow was gone. Zhuowen was worried that something might have happened to Yarou Shangjuan. However, the area was grey and it was difficult to identify the direction. Looking for a person here was like looking for a needle in a haystack. Sigh. I should go look for the space-time key first. Maybe I can meet Brother Yarou on the way. Zhuowen sighed and took out the yellow map from his spirit ring. The destination of the map was the location of the space-time key, and Zhuowen found that the location on the map was not far from here. Whoosh. After confirming the location, Zhuowen moved and left the place in an instant. Along the way, Zhuowen's eyes became more and more serious. He was sure that this place should be the third region of the river of space-time quicksand, the space-time law region, because he felt the space-time law and the space-time law at the same time in this space. The two great laws were independent yet interdependent. This subtle relationship caused Zhuowen, who was hurrying along, to suffer a lot. In this space where the space-time law and the space-time law coexisted, There was the infinite space in the spacetime law region, and there was also the rapid flow of time in the spacetime law region. This greatly slowed down Zhuowen's progress. However, Zhuowen had comprehended the spacetime law and the spacetime law. Although this space where the spacetime law and the spacetime law coexisted was difficult to deal with, Zhuowen could barely deal with it and continued to move forward. Zhuowen moved forward for 3 days and 3 nights. During this time, he was also comprehending the coexistence of the spacetime law and the spacetime law in this place. However, the more he researched, the more he realized that it would be very difficult for the time and space laws to coexist. At the very least, he was unable to grasp the laws behind them. Of course, the more Zhuowen researched, the more he admired the expert who had created the spacetime temple and the spacetime key. He knew that mastering the spacetime law was probably not as simple as comprehending a trace of the heavenly Tao law. To a certain extent, the path to mastering the spacetime law was much more difficult than comprehending a trace of the heavenly Tao law. This was because spacetime contained the laws of time and space. Moreover, after you fully comprehended these two laws, you had to try to find the pattern between these two laws. Only by grasping this pattern could you touch the threshold of the spacetime law. However, this was only the threshold of the spacetime law. There was still a long way to go before he could fully grasp the spacetime law. Although the laws of heavenly Tao were fraught with difficulties, reaching the 9 steps void sky steps only required one to grasp a wisp of the laws of heavenly Tao. In terms of difficulty, it was indeed slightly easier than completely grasping the laws of spacetime. Moreover, the steps were not as complicated as the laws of spacetime. It was no wonder that many cultivators who reached the 9 steps void sky ascension relied on comprehending a trace of the heavenly Tao. After all, this method was the most convenient and simple. Of course, there were many benefits to mastering the spacetime law to reach the 9 steps void sky. The complete spacetime law was much stronger than a trace of the heavenly Tao law. Even if the heavenly Tao law was superior to the spacetime law, it was only a trace of the heavenly Tao law. Naturally, it could not be compared to the complete spacetime law. Of course, many cultivators did not know about this, and Zhuowen had only heard about it from Ma Yujie. At first, he didn't believe the damn fatty, but now that he had comprehended the time and space laws, he began to believe the damn fatty's words. Shu Tian Nindeng, who had grasped the spacetime law, was much stronger than Shu Tian Nindeng, who had grasped a trace of the heavenly Tao. 3 days later, Zhuowen stopped in his tracks. His gaze landed in front of him. A magnificent world appeared in front of Zhuowen. It was different from the gloomy and dim aura of the other places. Standing there, Zhuowen felt like he was standing on a beach where the sun was about to set below the sea level. The red sunset glow was like a rainbow that formed a rainbow bridge over the distant sea. It also looked like a flame that was devouring the sea level. It looked magnificent and majestic. At the farthest point of the sunset clouds, a cliff slowly rose above the sea level as if it was sending off the last touch of the sunset. Zhuowen frowned slightly. He looked at the magnificent sunset scenery in front of him and felt a sense of awe. The sun sets in the west. The heartbroken person is at the end of the world. Suddenly, this poem involuntarily appeared in Zhuowen's mind. A feeling of sadness and twilight gradually rose in his heart. This was a lament about the passage of time and the absence of return. It was also a sigh about how time had flown by. Everything in the world, no matter how poor they were, was equal and the same when the sun set. The past, the present, the future, everything would eventually pass away. Just like the beautiful sunset, everything would eventually fall. Zhuowen stood silently under this beautiful sunset. He quietly looked at the sunset hanging above the sea level for 3 days and 3 nights. For 3 days and 3 nights, the sunset quietly hung high above the sea level. It did not set, nor did it show any signs of setting. It was as if time had stopped at the last moment of the sunset. Zhuowen's eyes showed that he was pondering. Then he took out the map from the spirit ring again and carefully observed the location of the spacetime key on the map. After confirming it again and again, Zhuowen found that the location of the spacetime key was on the sea level under the beautiful sunset. Putting away the map, Zhuowen looked at the sunset in the distance again and sighed. This sunset in the west is beautiful, but behind the beauty is infinite danger. Beauty is actually poisonous, but the helpless thing is that even if it is poisonous, I have to go in and try. How ironic. Having said that, Zhuowen took a step forward and jumped into the strange sea. What surprised Zhuowen was that the instant his feet landed on the surface of the sea, he discovered that the surface of the sea was actually still. Although it looked like a gentle sea, it had actually been completely frozen at this moment by time, and Zhuowen stepped into this place as if he was walking on flat ground. Not only that, the moment Zhuowen entered the sea surface, he found that his consciousness was actually infinitely suppressed. Originally, his consciousness could extend hundreds of millions of miles without a problem, but after entering the sea surface, his consciousness could only extend to a range of 10 miles. Moreover, Zhuowen felt that not only was his consciousness suppressed, but he was also surrounded by an endless vicissitude of time. Zhuowen was all too familiar with this feeling. It was the same feeling as the time law area. It was the feeling of time passing. Moreover, the passage of time in this sunset area was much faster than in the time law area. With the passage of time, Zhuowen also found that the surrounding space was constantly changing. Zhuowen looked at the sunset in front of him and found that it was sometimes far and sometimes near. Chapter 23:17. The setting sun. Taking a deep breath, Zhuowen began to move forward. The place where the setting sun stopped was the location of the spacetime key that Zhuowen knew to be. However, Zhuowen knew very well that it would be extremely difficult to approach the end of the setting sun. Day after day passed. Zhuowen walked on the surface of the sea for over a month, but the end of the setting sun was still so far away. Moreover, Zhuowen discovered that time passed even faster than before. If it weren't for the Heart of Life necklace on his chest providing him with an endless supply of vitality, Zhuowen knew that he might have already shown signs of aging. Finally, Zhuowen stopped. His eyes flickered as he said softly, "I can't keep going like this. There's a powerful law of space-time here. Time and space are fused together. Time is flying, and space is also switching." Zhuowen knew that it would be pointless for him to keep going like this. He would probably lose himself under the beautiful setting sun. I have to find the pattern between the laws of time and space. Otherwise, I won't be able to take a single step here. Zhuowen calmed down as he spoke. Then he took out a praying mat and sat down cross-legged on it. He began to study the pattern and flow of laws in the sea of setting sun. Zhuowen had completely comprehended the laws of time and space, but he was still rather ignorant about the laws of spacetime. However, Zhuowen firmly believed that as long as he could understand the laws of time and space, he would be able to truly enter the threshold of the laws of spacetime. At that time, Zhuowen would not be unable to take a single step in the sea of setting sun. Time ticked by. Zhuowen sat upright on the meditation cushion and concentrated on pondering the laws of space and time in the surroundings, and his gaze revealed an expression of deep thought. Zhuowen sat like this for 3 whole years. During these 3 years, he studied the laws of spacetime without moving at all. It was as if he was possessed. Finally, Zhuowen slowly opened his eyes. His eyes shone with a dazzling light. In the past 3 years, although Zhuowen still didn't understand the spacetime rules, he had some understanding of the laws of time and space operating at the same time. Although he only understood a little, it was a big step for Zhuowen. At least now that he understood this pattern, Zhuowen knew that he wouldn't get lost in the sea of sunset anymore. Zhuowen stood up and put away the praying mat, but his eyes fell on the necklace with the Heart of Life on it. The surface of the necklace was still emitting a green light, but compared to the beginning, the green light was much dimmer. Clearly, in the past 3 years, the surging vitality of the necklace had been greatly depleted. From this, it could be seen how terrifying the setting sun was. In just 3 years, it had already depleted the vitality of the Heart of Life to such an extent. Of course, it was also thanks to this Heart of Life that Zhuowen could quietly go into seclusion to comprehend the laws of time and space. Otherwise, with the influence of the terrifying power of the setting sun, it would have been difficult for Zhuowen to comprehend the laws of time and space with peace of mind. However, the Heart of Life gave him a good environment. This was also why Zhuowen could touch the threshold of the spacetime rules in 3 years. Of course, There was still a big gap from the real spacetime rules, and Zhuowen knew this. Taking a deep breath, Zhuowen temporarily took off the Heart of Life and put it in the spirit ring. He had already determined that this Heart of Life belonged to Yarou Shangjuan. Now that he had consumed it for 3 years, the vitality inside was actually not much. If he continued to wear it, he was afraid that the vitality of the Heart of Life would be completely exhausted. Zhuowen still planned to return this Heart of Life to Yarou Shangjuan after he found him. Naturally, he couldn't squander all the vitality in the Heart of Life. Otherwise, when he saw Yarou Shangjuan, he wouldn't be able to explain himself. After putting away the Heart of Life, Zhuowen clearly felt the terrifying feeling of time passing. When he stepped out, the surrounding space produced a strange and powerful pressure. Moreover, the cooperation of time and space in this place was extremely tacit. Zhuowen actually felt that his hands and feet were tied. It seems that this necklace really has a big effect. Zhuowen smiled bitterly. He didn't expect that after taking off the necklace, he would feel so uncomfortable. At least, he was not used to this kind of feeling of being tied up. Now he was even more certain that this necklace given to him by Yarou Shangjuan was definitely an extraordinary divine object. However, he was surprised that Yarou Shangjuan would leave this thing to him and leave without saying goodbye. Could it be that there was some secret behind it? However, Zhuowen vaguely guessed that Yarou Shangjuan might have something to do with the Heart of Time and Space. Of course, no matter what Yarou Shangjuan thought, Zhuowen was still very grateful to Yarou Shangjuan for giving him this necklace. Otherwise, Zhuowen wouldn't have recovered so quickly and wouldn't have been so relaxed after entering the Sea of Sunset. Now that Zhuowen had touched the threshold of the space-time law, even without the necklace, he wouldn't feel too strange. More importantly, at least he wouldn't get lost in this beautiful sunset as easily as before. For the next period of time, Zhuowen basically walked in the Sea of Sunset. And because Zhuowen had touched the threshold of the space-time law, he was no longer lost in this sea like before. The sunset at the end of the sea was also not as far away as before, no matter how far Zhuowen went. At least Zhuowen could now feel that he was slowly approaching the sunset at the end of the sea. Of course, the closer he got to the sunset, Zhuowen realized that the flow of time was faster, and the restrictions of space were stronger. The suppression of space-time was also stronger. Gradually, Zhuowen's skin started to age, and his hair gradually turned white. He was gradually aging under the suppression of space-time. When Zhuowen finally arrived in front of the cliff under the setting sun, he had completely become a white-haired old man, and his vitality was constantly being taken away. Although Zhuowen now looked like an old man in his twilight years, his eyes became brighter and clearer. Standing in front of the cliff, Zhuowen looked at the cliff in front of him and fell into deep thought. The cliff in front of him stood on the sea under the setting sun. Zhuowen noticed that this cliff was extremely high. If he looked carefully, he could see that the base of the cliff should be at the bottom of the Sea of Sunset. Chapter 23:18. Time is eternal. Zhuowen stared at the cliff in front of him with bright eyes. Once again, he thought of the poem that he had sighed with emotion. The sun sets in the west, and the heartbroken man is at the end of the world. This seemingly endless cliff that went straight into the clouds was probably the so-called end of the world, and the space-time key that Zhuowen was looking for should be here. Thinking of this, Zhuowen pushed off with his right foot and plunged into the sea around the cliff. The seawater in other places had already been frozen by time. Only the seawater in this area was still flowing, and Zhuowen was able to enter the base of the cliff through the flowing seawater. Although Zhuowen didn't know what was at the base of the cliff, he had a feeling that the space-time key should be there. Of course, all of this was just his intuition. Zhuowen had to go down and see for himself whether it was true or not. The moment Zhuowen plunged into the sea, he felt a bone-chilling coldness on his face. This coldness made Zhuowen's whole body shiver, and his body aged even faster. Clearly, the speed at which time passed in the sea was even more terrifying than on the surface. Zhuowen had no choice but to take out the necklace that Yarou Shangjuan had given him. He knew that with the speed at which time passed, Zhuowen would probably die of old age before he could reach the bottom of the sea. Therefore, he had no choice but to borrow the power of the necklace. After putting on the necklace, the aging speed of Zhuowen's body slowed down a lot. Moreover, relying on the surging vitality of the necklace, Zhuowen even started to become younger. Zhuowen looked at the necklace with a pained expression. The green light wasn't very bright, and he knew that although the vitality of the necklace wasn't much, it should be enough for him to last for quite some time. However, he was helpless because the vitality was decreasing every time he used it. This time, he was afraid that he would have to use up a lot of the vitality of the necklace. If he used up the necklace, Zhuowen would be too embarrassed to meet Yarrow Shangjuan again. Soon, Zhuowen dived to the bottom of the sea. Then, he saw a shocking scene at the bottom of the sea. The bottom of the sea was simply a world of ice. Except for the several feet around the cliff which was seawater, the surrounding was a world of frozen ice and snow. Zhuowen knew that the world of ice and snow around him was not really the power of ice and snow, but the power of time stagnation. When the seawater was still at a certain point in time, it would solidify as if it was frozen by cold air, forming an extremely low-temperature ice-like object. The surrounding seawater also followed the same principle. In addition, Zhuowen also saw many creatures in this world of ice and snow. Most of them were marine creatures. However, he also saw many cultivators. These cultivators were frozen in the sea, motionless. Zhuowen's gaze turned solemn. He discovered that most of the frozen cultivators' auras weren't weak. There were even a few cultivators whose auras weren't any weaker than Quang Li from the quicksand family. Clearly, this cultivator was most likely a half-step void sky 9th ascension expert. Furthermore, these cultivators were arranged in a very orderly manner. They actually surrounded the bottom of the cliff in a circular formation. Zhuowen guessed that the range of seawater around the cliff wasn't just a few feet. It was very likely that it was hundreds of feet, or even thousands of feet. However, for some unknown reason, the nearby seawater was frozen in time, and the cultivators who were still in the sea were unfortunately frozen in time with the seawater. Zhuowen looked around, and his gaze became more and more solemn. He felt that the bottom of the cliff wasn't simple. Otherwise, it wouldn't be able to freeze so many cultivators. Zhuowen's attention quickly fell on a remote corner on the left. In the ice and snow closest to the seawater, a beautiful figure completely attracted Zhuowen's attention. This was an extremely beautiful woman. The reason why she attracted Zhuowen's attention wasn't because of her beautiful appearance, but because she was no stranger to Zhuowen. Yarrow Shangjuan? Zhuowen frowned slightly. This beautiful woman was the beautiful woman that Zhuowen had met in the space law area before. At that time, this beautiful woman claimed to be Yarrow Shangjuan's sister. Previously, Zhuowen had gone to a secret realm with Yarrow Shangjuan and found a large number of spatial crystals inside. At that time, Zhuowen had a pretty good impression of Yarrow Shangjuan. However, Zhuowen felt that something was strange. Why was Yarrow Shangjuan at the bottom of the cliff? If he remembered correctly, Yarrow Shangjuan shouldn't be able to cross the Time Divine River. It was already very good that she could enter the Time Law area. However, Yarrow Shangjuan had entered the bottom of the cliff before him and was frozen in time in the seawater. This made Zhuowen even more puzzled. Sizing up Yarrow Shangjuan, who was trapped in time, Zhuowen's gaze quickly fell on Yarrow Shangjuan's right hand. He saw that Yarrow Shangjuan was holding a transparent crystal the size of half a palm. Upon closer inspection, the shape of this transparent crystal was somewhat similar to a heart. Space-time hollow. Zhuowen looked at the transparent crystal in Yarrow Shangjuan's palm and recalled the space-time hollow that Yarrow Shangjuan had mentioned to him before. He quickly associated the two. Yarrow Shangjuan's time should have frozen not long ago. What happened here at that time? Zhuowen thought to himself. However, he became more and more vigilant. He saw unwillingness and fear in Yarrow Shangjuan's open eyes. What happened at that time that made Yarrow Shangjuan reveal such an expression? Just as Zhuowen was lost in thought, an extremely horrifying feeling rose from Zhuowen's feet and rushed along his spine to the back of Zhuowen's head. This feeling was too strong. It was definitely a feeling that Zhuowen had never felt before. It was as if his lifeline had been strangled by an invisible force at this moment. What is your purpose in entering the bottom of the space-time cliff? A deep voice slowly sounded in Zhuowen's ears, but Zhuowen could not tell where the voice came from. You only have 3 breaths of time. If you don't give me an answer, you will end up like those cultivators. The deep voice sounded again, but there was a trace of impatience in the voice. Zhuowen took a deep breath and said helplessly, I'm here for the space-time key. The deep voice was silent for a moment, but then it laughed loudly. You are very honest. Poochie. Zhuowen spat out a mouthful of blood. His chest felt as if it had been hit hard, and he was suddenly sent flying and smashed into the edge of the cliff behind him. Because the force was too great, Zhuowen's whole body was embedded in the cliff wall. Zhuowen's eyes revealed a look of horror. His face was as pale as snow, and the will to resist in his heart had completely disappeared. This unknown power was too terrifying. In front of this power, Zhuowen actually felt powerless. It was as if he was an ant facing a vast ocean. Back then, when Zhuowen faced Great Brahma and Mu Chenxue, whose temperament had changed drastically, he did not feel this way. But now, facing this unknown force, he actually felt this strange feeling. Chapter 23:19. Mysterious Head, Who Are You? Zhuowen's entire body was embedded in the rock wall. He wanted to break free from the rock wall, but he found that there were many stone hands stretching out from the rock wall, grabbing Zhuowen's limbs and neck, firmly fixing him in the rock wall. These stone hands were not ordinary stone hands, but stone hands that contained extremely powerful space-time laws. The moment Zhuowen's limbs were grabbed by these stone hands, he felt that time and space were completely sealed, and he could not move at all. Zhuowen raised his head, his pupils constricting into needles as he stared straight ahead. It was unknown when, but a huge head had appeared in front of them. This head was as big as Zhuowen's entire body. However, its face was glistening with blood, and it looked exceptionally ferocious and terrifying. It was almost to the point of being badly mutilated. Moreover, Zhuowen also found that this huge head had only one eye, and the left eye was incomplete, leaving only an empty bloody hole, from which thick black blood was constantly flowing. The right eye was quite strange. The white of the eye was blood red, and the pupil was golden. When the pupil blinked, an extremely strange blood flame would spurt out. The moment he saw the right eye of this head, Zhuowen's pupils unconsciously shrank, because this was not the first time he had seen this right eye, but the second time. Back then, when he was in the Sun-Moon Lake, he had entered a strange small world. There was a blood-stained cliff, and an eyeball was suppressed in that cliff. That eyeball was exactly the same as the right eye of the head in front of him. There was no doubt that this eyeball should be the empty left eye of this head. It must be known that Ma Yujie had guessed that the eyeball suppressed in the blood-stained cliff should be the eyeball of a Tao-confirming powerhouse. Tao-confirming powerhouses were even more terrifying than Shu Tian Jiudeng. Zhuowen was very clear that this bloody head in front of him was a Tao-confirming powerhouse. Although this bloody head did not seem to have any harmful power, Zhuowen knew that as long as this head wanted to, it could kill him. You've seen me. The mangled head took a deep look at Zhuowen before it slowly opened its mouth and said. Zhuowen frowned but didn't say anything. The head in front of him was too terrifying. It could kill him as easily as squashing an ant. Zhuowen didn't dare to say anything. Do you want me to search your soul? Are you still not going to speak? The head said coldly. Zhuowen sneered again and again, but he still didn't say anything. If this head could search one's soul, it probably wouldn't waste any words with him and would directly search his soul. However, the head hadn't done so. Instead, it had asked Zhuowen to say it himself. This meant that the head didn't have the ability to search his soul. I said yes, but I also want to ask you a question, Zhuowen said in a deep voice. The head narrowed its eyes. It was a little surprised that the little cultivator in front of it was not only not frightened by it, but also fearlessly raised conditions with it. Interesting. Answer my question first. After the head finished speaking, it noticed Zhuowen remained indifferent, and it said with slight displeasure, Don't worry, I always keep my word. It's impossible for me to go back on my word. The head obviously paused for a moment when it spoke of its name, and Zhuowen suspected that the head's memories were missing or had been sealed by someone. Otherwise, it was impossible for it to even forget its name. All right. Zhuowen agreed, and then he pondered for a moment before he said, I once saw an eyeball on a blooded cliff, and this eyeball was exactly the same as your eyeball. There was a pool of true dragon blood at the side of that blooded cliff, and an enormous heart was sealed within that pool of blood. When he spoke up to hear, Zhuowen recalled the words he'd heard on the blooded cliff that day, and he couldn't help but mutter, Return my heart. Return my eyes. Return my arms. Return my legs. Return everything to me. Boom. After Zhuo Wengang finished speaking, a terrifying thunderous voice suddenly resounded. Then, a terrifying gust of wind came crashing down like a 10,000 zhong tall mountain. Zhuowen, who was embedded in the rock wall, was the closest to the head. Immediately, his chest was blasted open by this terrifying gust of wind. Blood gushed out, and he was seriously injured. If it weren't for the necklace on Zhuowen's chest, which had a strong vitality, Zhuowen wouldn't have been able to keep his life. In addition, Zhuowen's whole body was bound, and he couldn't take out the heavenly domain star essence, so the necklace on his body could really be said to have saved Zhuowen's life. When Zhuowen's blasted chest gradually recovered in the green light, the necklace on Zhuowen's chest finally became completely dim and lost its last trace of vitality. Zhuowen sighed softly. He knew that the necklace was now completely useless, but at the same time, he was shocked by the terror of this head. Just the aura it revealed almost killed him. If it weren't for this necklace, Zhuowen would have been doomed. Perhaps noticing Zhuowen's strange state, the head restrained its powerful aura and looked at Zhuowen excitedly. It said in a deep voice, Do you know where my eyes are? Zhuowen took a deep breath. He didn't dare to talk in riddles. This head was too terrifying, and he really didn't dare to neglect it. If this guy was angry, its aura would be even more terrifying. It's suppressed in a blood-stained cliff, but it's very far from here. It's not in the Six Desires heavenly domain, but in another heavenly domain, Zhuowen said in a deep voice. I didn't expect you to have clues about my eyes. Immediately, the stone hands that grabbed his limbs slowly retracted into the rock wall and disappeared completely. You came here for the space-time key, the head asked indifferently. Zhuowen nodded, but his gaze was on guard as he looked at the mangled head. I'm afraid you don't know the price of coming here. Look at those guys. Most of them came for the space-time key. Of course, a small part of them came for the space-time core. Chapter 2320. Trials. Zhuowen's gaze landed on Yarou Shangjuan, who had been completely frozen in time. Even though this beautiful woman had been completely frozen in time, she still gave off a soul-stirring beauty. Coupled with the helplessness and fear in Yarou Shangjuan's eyes, it was very easy to arouse a man's desire to protect her. Senior, are they all dead? Zhuowen asked in a heavy voice. The head shook its head and said indifferently, They've been frozen in time. In that time, they've become eternal, but they haven't died. Of course, their current state is no different from being dead. Zhuowen sighed gently when he heard that. He could tell from the mysterious head that Yarou Shangjuan had only been frozen in time by the terrifying laws of spacetime. Her life was not in danger. Of course, if Yarou Shangjuan and the others remained like that, they would be no different from being dead. However, in Zhuowen's opinion, that was much better than being dead. Since their lives were not in danger, it was possible for them to recover. However, it was basically impossible for them to come back from the dead. By the way, Senior, what's the trial you mentioned before? Zhuowen suddenly asked. The head sneered, I'd advise you not to set your sights on the spacetime key. The trial on the spacetime key is not something a brat like you can pass. You might even lose your life when the time comes. With that, the head said earnestly, Come back when you're stronger. At that time, I'll directly teleport you here for you to undergo the trial. However, Zhuowen shook his head and said, Senior, I'm determined to obtain the spacetime key this time. I can't afford to lose it. Zhuowen knew very well that the reason why the mysterious head was suddenly so concerned about him was because it wanted to rely on Zhuowen to retrieve its left eye and heart. This time, the spacetime key was closely related to the mysterious head. If Zhuowen did not take advantage of this relationship, he would really be a blockhead. The head's eyes narrowed slightly. He was no fool and naturally knew what Zhuowen was planning. However, it didn't care. The only thing it cared about was its missing left eye and heart. The white-clothed young man in front of it was the only person who knew the whereabouts of its left eye and heart. Naturally, it wouldn't miss such a good opportunity. If Senior can help me obtain the spacetime key, Junior is willing to go through fire and water to obtain Senior's left eye and heart. Zhuowen cupped his fists. The head's gaze relaxed, but it quickly became serious. The spacetime key is not under my control. It was left behind by the master of the spacetime temple. The trial was also set up by the master of the spacetime temple. Even the entire river of spacetime quicksand was created by the master of the spacetime temple. If I was at my peak, it would be possible for me to break through the methods of the temporal temple's master and help you obtain the temporal key. Unfortunately, in my current state, when the mysterious head said this, it laughed at itself and shook its head. Its eyes were filled with helplessness. Zhuowen sighed inwardly. Although he had guessed that the mysterious head did not have absolute control over the spacetime key, he did not expect that the mysterious head would be completely useless. Thinking of this, Zhuowen secretly admired the master of the spacetime temple. He was certain that the master of the spacetime temple was definitely a Dao-proving realm expert. Moreover, he was one of the more powerful Dao-proving realm experts. When the mysterious head saw the dimness in Zhuowen's eyes, it immediately snorted coldly and said, "Do you think I'm completely useless to the spacetime key? If that's what you think, then you're gravely mistaken." Zhuowen's eyes lit up and he hurriedly said, "Senior, can you help me obtain the spacetime key?" The mysterious head said indifferently, "You'll have to rely on yourself. However, I can suppress a portion of the trial's power and make it less difficult for you to enter. That way, your chances of passing the trial will be much higher." Zhuowen's expression was calm. He knew that the mysterious head would not help him out of the kindness of its heart. There was definitely a condition, and Zhuowen could roughly guess the condition. As a condition of the deal, you need to find my left eye and heart for me in the future and swear an oath to the heavenly Tao. If you break the oath, may the heavens and earth destroy you, your soul will be destroyed, and you will never be able to reincarnate. When the mysterious head said this, it looked at Zhuowen and a faint killing intent emanated from the head. Then, like a raging wave, it began to grow stronger and stronger. In the end, it was all applied to Zhuowen. Zhuowen was barely able to resist this killing intent, and his countenance was pale like snow while his entire body trembled. He was very clearly aware that this mysterious head was forcefully pressuring him, and if he didn't tactfully agree this time, then this mysterious head would definitely not let him off. "Don't worry, Senior. I agree to your condition." Zhuowen clasped his fist. Before a terrifying expert like the mysterious head, Zhuowen did not dare to play any tricks. Instead, he agreed without hesitation. Only after Zhuowen agreed did the terrifying killing intent from the mysterious head gradually recede. Zhuowen sighed gently. "I'll give you 100 years. If you don't bring my left eye and heart in 100 years, I think you know the consequences," the mysterious head sneered. The mysterious head laughed coldly. Soon after, a bloody glow flashed in its eyes. Soon after, it drew a complicated array in the air and imprinted it on Zhuowen's forehead. Zhuowen could not resist at all. The mysterious head was far stronger than him. Even if he wanted to resist, the aura of the mysterious head suppressed him to the point that he could not move at all. He could only passively accept the blood-red formation drawn by the mysterious head. When the blood-red array formation entered his forehead, Zhuowen knew that this was a seal that the mysterious head had placed on him. For the next 100 years, he, Zhuowen, would be completely fine. However, if he still did not come looking for the mysterious head after 100 years and did not bring back the left eye and heart as promised, then Zhuowen's death would come. When the blood-red formation was completely imprinted in the depths of Zhuowen's sea of consciousness, Zhuowen slowly opened his eyes. His gaze was as calm as an ancient well. He was not as angry as the mysterious head had imagined. "You have a good temperament." The mysterious head gave a rare compliment. "You want to see me roar in anger. So what if I'm angry? Will you remove the seed you planted in me?" Zhuowen said indifferently. The mysterious head snickered and said, "So you're going to accept your fate?" Zhuowen shook his head and said, "I'm not accepting my fate. I'm just acknowledging our cooperation. Since we're working together, even if you didn't plant the seed in me, I would still bring back your left eye and heart. Of course, since you want to plant the seed in me, it's only natural to have an extra layer of protection." Chapter 23:21. Comprehension. Let's cut the crap. "Senior, please give me some pointers on the trial of the spacetime key," Zhuowen said indifferently. The mysterious head nodded and stopped talking nonsense. Instead, it looked at the bottom of the cliff and said indifferently, "The spacetime key is buried at the bottom of the cliff. When you dig out the bottom of the cliff, the trial will begin. However, I have to tell you that the trial is very dangerous. If you fail, you will end up like these people. You will be frozen in time forever, like a living dead." As it said that, the mysterious head looked at the area where time was frozen like a world of ice and snow. The cultivators there were frozen in time. "Let's begin." Zhuowen did not want to waste time, so he interrupted the mysterious head. The mysterious head was not annoyed. It quietly watched Zhuowen head to the bottom of the cliff. When Zhuowen's right hand landed on the bottom of the cliff, he immediately sensed that the bottom of the cliff possessed the laws of space and time that caused him to tremble in fear. It was like a storm that poured down on him. The power of the laws of spacetime was extremely powerful. It was far more powerful than the other areas of the ocean. Under the influence of the laws of spacetime, Zhuowen felt like every inch of his skin and flesh was constantly dislocated. It was as if he would collapse at any moment. Don't resist. This is the suction force that will bring you into the trial. The more you resist, the stronger the suction force will be. When the time comes, you might be torn to pieces by the suction force. Just as Zhuowen was struggling to resist the sudden suction force, the mysterious head's voice slowly echoed in Zhuowen's mind. Zhuowen took a deep breath when he heard that. He completely gave up resisting, and the power of the laws of spacetime flowed into Zhuowen's body. Afterward, Zhuowen discovered that the power of the laws of spacetime did not bring him the pain he expected. Instead, there was a trace of comfort, and he disappeared from the spot. When Zhuowen opened his eyes again, he discovered that everything before him had changed greatly. There was no longer the ocean before him, nor was there a cliff buried at the bottom of the sea. There was no bloody mysterious head. What appeared before Zhuowen was an extremely long plank road. The plank road was completely made of wood. Below the plank road was the boundless ocean. Moreover, the ocean was grey, which made it look particularly strange. Zhuowen's gaze fell on the end of the plank road. The plank road extended into the depths of the ocean. At the end of the plank road was a red sunset. The warm glow of the sunset sprinkled on the horizon, adding a trace of color and vitality to the originally lifeless grey ocean. Walk on the plank road and comprehend the sunset that is about to disappear. Otherwise, you will never be able to leave this place. An indifferent voice slowly resounded through the world. The voice was very unfamiliar, completely different from the voice of the mysterious head. Zhuowen knew that the owner of the voice was someone else. Furthermore, it was very likely that it had been left behind by the so-called master of the temporal temple. Zhuowen pondered for a moment. The moment the voice that resounded in the world faded away, he took large strides forward. Zhuowen's speed was neither fast nor slow. He did not forcefully increase his speed for the sake of speed. Instead, he ran forward as if he was chasing after his life. Just like that, Zhuowen walked on the plank road for 10 days. However, during these 10 days, it was as if Zhuowen was walking on the spot. Let alone comprehend the sunset, it was impossible for him to even approach it. On the contrary, it was more like he was walking on the spot. Zhuowen did not panic. He had encountered this situation in the ocean before. This was a trial stage set up by the master of the temporal temple. The laws of spacetime here were much stronger than in the ocean. Back then, Zhuowen's laws of spacetime had not reached the threshold, so he could only gradually lose himself in the ocean. It was only when he reached the threshold of the laws of spacetime that he finally approached the sunset and arrived at the edge of the heartbroken cliff. However, the laws of spacetime here were much more terrifying. If Zhuowen did not want to lose himself here, he could only further comprehend the laws of spacetime. Only by absorbing the power of the laws of spacetime could Zhuowen fight poison with poison. Zhuowen sighed softly. In the end, he took out the spacetime force that he had fused with the laws of space and time on the heavenly armor continent. Although his laws of spacetime had reached the threshold, it was simply impossible for him to obtain the spacetime force. At least for the time being, it was unlikely that Zhuowen would be able to obtain the spacetime force. However, Zhuowen now possessed the sliver of spacetime force he had obtained on the heavenly armor continent. Coupled with the fact that Zhuowen had already reached the threshold of the laws of spacetime, Zhuowen was able to use the sliver of spacetime force much more easily. Zhuowen continued forward this time, and the sliver of spacetime force lingered around him at all times. With the protection of the sliver of spacetime force, Zhuowen found that the spacetime suppression of this place was no longer so powerful and terrifying. Zhuowen continued forward. The plank road was no longer as illusory and vague as before. Instead, it was real. At least now, Zhuowen was constantly moving forward, constantly approaching the sunset at the end. When Zhuowen finally reached the end of the plank road, Zhuowen had already become an old man with a head full of white hair. He had sunk into his twilight years, just like the beautiful sunset floating above the sea, about to fall and disappear. Zhuowen had a feeling that if the setting sun at the end of the horizon really fell, his life would end just like the setting sun. That mysterious head said that I have to comprehend the sunset when I enter this place, but it didn't ask me to comprehend the laws of spacetime. Zhuowen seemed to have caught on to something as he secretly considered what the mysterious head had said to him. His gaze was fixed on the beautiful sunset at the end of the horizon as he gradually fell into a state of absent-mindedness. And the moment Zhuowen came to the end of the plank road, the originally motionless sunset began to slowly fall. Although it was very slow, Zhuowen could feel that the sunset was indeed falling. At this speed, he would probably be completely submerged in the sea very soon. Zhuowen sat down cross-legged. He stared at the setting sun in a daze, but his heart was extremely calm. Even though he could clearly sense that his life was gradually fading away as the sun set in the west, he was still calm. When the sunset finally fell into the sea and the entire sea sank into darkness, Zhuowen slowly closed his eyes. His vitality was completely severed as if he had completely died with the sunset. The endless darkness lasted for a long time. Then, at the end of the darkness, a rising sun appeared again. This rising sun was filled with vigor and vitality, as if it was fearless. At the end of the plank road, a figure silently sat cross-legged. This was a figure that could not be any older. The moment the sun rose, the white-haired old man suddenly moved. He slowly raised his head and looked at the rising sun as an indescribable emotion appeared at the corner of his mouth. The true power of spacetime is hidden in this sunrise and sunset. Chapter 23-22. The waning sun at sea. The sun rose and set, and the sun came and went. On the vast surface of the sea, a boundless plank road stretched out at the end of the sea. At the end of the plank road, a figure with a straight back sat quietly with his legs crossed. Regardless of whether the sun rose from the east or the setting sun set in the west, the figure sat there motionlessly, as if he had passed away. The only change was that between sunrise and sunset, the hair that draped over his shoulders constantly changed between black and white, as if he was returning to his youth and returning to his old age. Zhuowen sat quietly at the end of the plank road. He seemed to have forgotten how long he had been sitting there. He only knew that his life force was constantly being created and destroyed between sunrise and sunset. This feeling was not pleasant. However, Zhuowen knew that this was the only way he could fully comprehend the setting sun hanging high above the sea. Another setting sun slowly set from the sea. When this setting sun was almost halfway below the sea, Zhuowen suddenly stood up. A poem involuntarily appeared in his mind. A setting sun spreads across the water, half the river is red, half the river is red. Just as he finished reciting, Zhuowen waved his sleeve. Immediately, the setting sun that had fallen below the sea stopped at this moment. Setting sun on the sea, time and space. Zhuowen muttered in a low voice. As if he had caught on to something, the understanding in his eyes became even more intense. On the surface of the sea, sunrise and sunset represented the passage of time, and also the movement of space. The usual sunrise and sunset became so profound and mysterious in Zhuowen's eyes at this moment. Zhuowen waved his sleeve again, and the originally still setting sun slowly fell below the surface of the sea. In the end, the entire sea fell into darkness. Zhuowen sat cross-legged in the darkness, but his eyes emitted a frightening light. The rising sun rose at sunrise, and the setting sun set at sunset. This was the law of nature. Zhuowen, on the other hand, wanted to do the opposite. When the sun rose, the setting sun would rise, allowing the beauty of the sunset and the vitality of the sunrise to combine together. The energy produced by such a clash would be extremely terrifying. Of course, all of this was Zhuowen's imagination. When he had first entered this place, the voice had said something ambiguous, telling him to comprehend the setting sun. There were no specific requirements for comprehending the sunset. Zhuowen knew that the key was to comprehend it. No matter what you comprehended, as long as you could comprehend something from this beautiful sunrise and sunset, Zhuowen knew that you would be able to leave this place. Taking a deep breath, Zhuowen began to use the sliver of space-time force in his body. He knew that although there was not much space-time force, Zhuowen had a little grasp of the space-time law, so he could unleash the strongest power of this sliver of space-time force. Thinking up to here, Zhuowen's right hand formed a sword finger and suddenly pointed out in the air. Instantly, waves of mysterious energy actually suffused out from the area around his fingertips, spreading out in circles. At the very front of the plank road, the dark sea suddenly erupted with endless splashes of water. Following that, the splashes of water began to condense and soar into the sky, as if something was about to break out from the bottom of the sea. The splashes of water became more and more violent. Following that, a ray of light overflowed from the dark sea. The light was not intense, but it had a kind of beauty to it. Splash. Finally, the light became even more exuberant. The surroundings were dyed dark red, and a huge setting sun slowly rose from the sea. The setting sun emitted a red light, and the afterglow dyed the white clouds in the sky red, making the white clouds in the sky look like they were on fire. It was dazzling and wonderful. Zhuowen looked at the setting sun that rose again, and there was a sense of excitement and heroism in his heart. He knew that after sitting for countless days, he had finally comprehended the true essence of the setting sun, and relied on the space-time force to create his own divine ability. It should be known that a self-created divine ability was much more powerful than a divine ability learned from others. This was because a self-created divine ability was completely compatible with one's body, and could unleash its greatest power. Moreover, a self-created divine ability could be used continuously as one's cultivation base increased, and its power would continue to increase. It could be used continuously, and it would not be eliminated. After all, as Zhuowen continued to cultivate and improve, he could continuously perfect the power of the self-created divine ability, making it more compatible with him. In the future, this divine ability will be called the ocean's waning sun. The corner of Zhuowen's mouth revealed a trace of a happy smile. He had always wanted to create a divine ability of his own, but how could it be so easy to create a divine ability? If it weren't for the trial arranged by the Spacetime Temple's master, Zhuowen wouldn't have been able to comprehend this divine ability through the spacetime force. The moment the setting sun rose to its highest point, the vast sea under the setting sun suddenly boiled, and terrifying giant dragons appeared. It was as if 10,000 dragons were rushing out of the sea. The scene was extremely spectacular. Zhuowen stood on the plank road with his hands behind his back. His eyes revealed a smile as he quietly admired the raging sea. He was very satisfied with the power of the ocean's waning Sunday. He knew that once this divine ability was used, it would be enough to fight against a half-step void sky ninth-step cultivator. Moreover, as Zhuowen's comprehension of the space-time law deepened, the power of his divine ability would only become stronger and more terrifying. At that time, he believed that it would be comparable to the void sky ninth-step heavenly Dao law. This is the bottom of the sea. When the endless sea water went crazy because of the setting sun, the bottom of the sea gradually emerged. Zhuowen's gaze involuntarily fell on the bottom of the sea. When he saw the sparkling and translucent crystals exposed on the bottom of the sea, his eyes suddenly became blazing and excited. This was because these crystals were all time and space crystals. These two kinds of crystals were extremely rare in the time and space law areas, but there were actually countless of them at the bottom of the sea. They were like countless pebbles in a stream, densely packed together. There are so many time and space crystals. Zhuo Wen's eyes burned with passion. Without even thinking, he flew down, and his divine sense transformed into a giant hand that reached the heavens, grabbing at the crystals without hesitation. Zhuowen's speed of grabbing the crystals was extremely fast. Each time, he would grab hundreds or thousands of crystals. However, there were too many crystals here. Compared to all the crystals on the bottom of the sea, the crystals he grabbed were simply a drop in the ocean. When the setting sun gradually disappeared, the raging sea water calmed down again, and the exposed bottom of the sea was completely submerged by the sea water. Zhuowen returned to the plank road before the sea calmed down. Zhuowen's face was slightly pale. The ocean's waning sun consumed a lot of his energy. This time, he had just comprehended this divine ability, so he could only use it once at most. He couldn't use it continuously. Chapter 23-23. Frog-headed monster. It would be perfect if I could get all the crystals at the bottom of the sea. Zhuowen sighed with some regret. Of course, all of this was just Zhuowen's fantasy. The number of crystals at the bottom of the sea had reached a terrifying level. Even without the obstruction of the sea, Zhuowen would probably need a few months to collect them all. However, Zhuowen was quite satisfied with the harvest this time. In just a short period of time, Zhuowen had collected over 10,000 crystals. If this was in the outside world, it would cause a huge sensation. I've already comprehended my own divine ability. This trial should be considered passed, right? Zhuowen took out a praying mat. After recuperating for a while, he stood up again and looked around at the quiet sea. He frowned slightly. He felt that the surroundings were too quiet. There was no movement at all. Splash! Just as Zhuowen was puzzled, an extremely ear-piercing sound of water suddenly appeared on the calm sea surface. Then, a huge whirlpool appeared on the surface of the water 1,000 miles in front of the plank road. This whirlpool was dark and it was impossible to see what was inside. Zhuowen stood on the plank road and silently looked at the whirlpool in the water. After waiting for a while, he found that there was no creature or monster coming out of the whirlpool. He frowned and muttered to himself in a low voice, could this be the entrance to a certain place? Zhuowen's guess was not without reason. After the whirlpool appeared in the water, Zhuowen clearly felt that there was a teleportation power in the whirlpool. Clearly, this whirlpool was a teleportation array. However, Zhuowen was hesitant about whether he should enter the whirlpool or not. After waiting for a while, Zhuowen confirmed that this whirlpool was indeed not dangerous. He took a step with his right foot and jumped into the depths of the whirlpool. Soon, he disappeared inside. After Zhuowen disappeared into the whirlpool, the eyes of the mysterious head in the outside world flickered. Its gaze landed on a figure in front of it. This figure was emitting a strange glow. Not bad. To think that he would be able to comprehend the laws of space-time. This fellow is much stronger than those trash from before. Although I have lowered the difficulty of the trial by a little, it was still not easy to pass. For this kid to be able to pass, it goes to show how strong his talent is. The mysterious head mumbled to itself, and the figure that its gaze fell upon was actually Zhuowen. However, at this moment, Zhuowen landed not far away from Yao Shengjuan. His surroundings were frozen by ice. He was motionless and his expression was serene. Clearly, Zhuowen was also frozen in time. However, the only difference between him and the others was that his body emitted a strange light, while the others did not. The mysterious head knew that this light represented that Zhuowen's soul had not yet been lost in the trial. Once this child was completely lost, the strange light would also disappear, and Zhuowen would never be able to return. This time, what entered the trial was not Zhuowen's physical body, but Zhuowen's soul. The mysterious head did not tell Zhuowen this. It knew that if it told Zhuowen, it would only cause the latter to have more worries. Thus, it might as well keep it from Zhuowen. After entering the trial, Zhuowen's soul would leave, but his physical body would be frozen in time for eternity. Only if he passed the trial would the time freeze disappear. At that time, Zhuowen would also completely obtain the space-time key. Zhuowen opened his eyes and found that he was still on a plank road in front of him. The surroundings were misty white, but Zhuowen knew that this plank road should also be built in a sea. This was because he heard the sound of crashing water and waves. Zhuowen did not know where this place was, but he knew that the only thing he could do now was to move forward. He knew that the road ahead would definitely have the answer he wanted. This place also had the space-time constraint, but it did not have much effect on Zhuowen now. After all, he had comprehended a part of the space-time law and also had a trace of the power of space-time. He had also created the sun waning above the sea. The space-time constraint had long lost any effect on him. After Zhuowen slowly disappeared into the fog, a head poked out from under the plank road where Zhuowen had just been. This head looked like a frog with a pair of round eyes. It stared in the direction that Zhuowen had left and sneered, "Another one has come to die. This guy's soul looks quite delicious. Perhaps Sir will like it. I'll go inform him first." After saying that, the monster slowly dived into the water and left. Zhuowen walked for 3 hours and finally found that the surrounding fog had gradually thinned out. At the same time, he noticed that in the distance, he saw the outline of an island. Looking at the outline, the island was not big, but Zhuowen smelled an ominous premonition from the island. Boom, boom, boom. Suddenly, there was the sound of water splashing, and then a series of fierce black shadows swept towards Zhuowen at an extremely fast speed. Zhuowen took a deep breath and immediately took out the Emperor's sword. The Emperor's sword in his right hand abruptly swept out, and in an instant, the sword light turned into a waterfall that connected the heavens and the earth. It actually laid across Zhuowen's body, turning into a revolving barrier. Bang! 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 A series of sounds like hailstones were heard, and then Zhuowen discovered that these black shadows were actually fist-sized ice cubes. To be more precise, these were not ice cubes, but fist-sized water droplets frozen at a certain point in time by the space-time law. These water droplets contained the space-time law, and if one was hit by them, it would not feel good. Zhuowen swung his sword again and again, barely managing to block the ice that fell like raindrops. His gaze also noticed his surroundings, and he discovered that numerous heads had emerged from the surface of the sea. They were densely packed together. These heads were very strange. They were shaped like frog heads, and their fan-like palms grabbed the seawater around them and threw it towards Zhuowen. Zhuowen blocked the falling ice cubes around him, but his eyes revealed a look of shock. He knew very well that the sea below the plank road was eternally frozen at a certain point in time by the space-time law, just like ice cubes. No creature could travel through such seawater, and basically all of them were frozen at the bottom of the sea. However, these countless frog-headed monsters that appeared in front of him not only traveled through the sea, but also grabbed the frozen seawater and threw it at him. How could Zhuowen not be shocked? Fortunately, these frog-headed monsters were not strong, and there were no energy fluctuations on their bodies. It seemed that they only knew how to use brute force. However, Zhuowen did not dare to be careless because these monsters had a natural advantage. Their bodies contained the space-time law, so they could freely travel through this strange sea and use the space-time water to attack. If an ordinary cultivator was hit by so much space-time water, they would undoubtedly die, but Zhuowen was not so bad. After all, he had comprehended a part of the space-time law. At most, he would be a little embarrassed. Sword Dragon slashes the sky. Zhuowen knew that if he kept defending, he would lose, so he had to take the initiative to attack. Otherwise, these monsters would definitely exhaust his strength. Zhuowen swung his sword, and suddenly, the soaring sword chi intertwined with each other and condensed into a huge dragon above Zhuowen. Chapter 23-24. Island Boom. 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 The sword dragon swept out with a terrifying aura. The attention of the frog-headed monsters, who were originally focused on Zhuowen, was immediately diverted by the sword dragon. Then, some of the frog-headed monsters immediately grabbed the space-time seawater around them and threw it at the sword dragon. In less than 10 breaths, the imposing sword dragon was completely defeated by the attacks of the frog-headed monsters. Zhuowen knew how powerful the frog-headed monsters were, so he naturally did not place his hopes on the sword dragon. His main purpose was to attract the attention of the frog-headed monsters, and he had achieved his goal. Zhuowen waved his right hand, and immediately, the Blood Immortal Sword and the Thunder Fire Sword were summoned. As soon as the two divine swords appeared, under Zhuowen's signal, they rushed out and swept toward the distracted frog-headed monsters. As for the space-time rules here, although it affected the Blood Immortal Sword and the Thunder Fire Sword, Zhuowen used time and space crystals to refine a simple formation and arranged it on the two divine swords. Therefore, although the space-time rules could affect the two divine swords, it was not to the extent of making it difficult for the two divine swords to move. Poochie. Poochie. The Thunder Fire Sword and the Blood Immortal Sword grasped the timing just right. Before the frog-headed monsters could recover from their focus on the sword dragon, the two divine swords began to kill them. For a moment, blood splattered everywhere, and the frog-headed monsters were killed by the two divine swords. Their blood flowed like a river. The two divine swords immediately attracted the attention of the other frog-headed monsters, who were attacking Zhuowen. Then, the frog-headed monsters roared angrily and threw the space-time seawater in their hands at the two divine swords, trying to stop the two divine swords from killing. Zhuowen's mouth revealed a mocking smile. After the rest of the frog-headed monster's attention was attracted by the Blood Immortal Sword and the Thunder Fire Sword, his burden was immediately relieved. Soul kill. Zhuowen growled, and his consciousness immediately scattered countless needle-like objects, which then turned into rain and fell densely. In an instant, more than half of the frog-headed monsters were killed by soul kill. The remaining frog-headed monsters reacted quickly and immediately dove into the sea to avoid the disaster. Zhuowen looked at the calm sea and smiled. He put away the Blood Immortal Sword and the Thunder Fire Sword and walked toward the island along the plank road. When Zhuowen arrived near the island, he finally got a clear view of the island. The island was not big, and it was full of bony rocks. At a glance, it was impossible to see any green plants. The entire island was lifeless and lifeless. Zhuowen's divine sense was extremely powerful. Although he was still some distance away from the island, his divine sense had already swept into the island, allowing him to see the whole picture of the island. There's actually someone here? Zhuowen raised his eyebrows. Just now, when his divine sense entered the island, he actually found 3 people on the island. These 3 people were all men. 2 of them were younger, and the last one looked like a middle-aged man in his 40s. However, Zhuowen found that these 3 people were sitting in the stone hall, drinking to drown their sorrows. They looked extremely dispirited. Third brother. How long have we been trapped here? The middle-aged man picked up a jug of wine and looked at the black-clothed young man who was holding his cheek and asked with drunken eyes. The black-clothed young man looked at the middle-aged man and said with a self-deprecating smile, "Big brother, I don't know how long we've been trapped here. I only know that it's been so long that I don't have any concept of time." The blue-clothed young man sitting opposite the middle-aged man picked up a jug of wine and took a big gulp. Then, he threw the jug on the ground, his eyes full of determination. "I don't want to be a coward anymore. Big brother, third brother, there are only 3 of us left on this island. Are we going to be cowards like this forever?" The blue-clothed young man said with a murderous look. The middle-aged man said bitterly, "Second brother, don't be so impulsive. Are you going to face that monster? You know, once we're killed by that monster, we'll die directly. Our souls and divine souls will be annihilated. There's no chance of survival. But what's the difference between this and death? I'd rather die than live like a coward." After the blue-clothed young man finished speaking, he took a step forward and rushed toward the plank road outside the island. However, the blue-clothed young man didn't rush out for long before he was stopped by the middle-aged man and the black-clothed young man. "Second brother, don't be impulsive. We still have hope. As long as a monster enters the trial and successfully passes it, then we'll be safe. If you rush out now, You'll only be throwing your life away. Even if someone passes the trial in the future, you won't have a chance to live. The middle-aged man advised earnestly. The black-clothed young man also hurriedly advised, "Second brother, big brother is right. We can only continue to wait. It's not worth it for you to go out and throw your life away." On the plank road, Zhuowen's eyes flickered. From the words of the three people, Zhuowen heard a lot of information. It seemed that the three of them were trapped here, and the three of them seemed to be very afraid of the things on the plank road. However, there were only those frog-headed monsters on the plank road. These frog-headed monsters were nothing to Zhuowen, so why were the three of them so afraid? Moreover, the strength of the three of them wasn't bad. If they were able to enter the island before, then they must have fought with these frog-headed monsters. There was no need to be so afraid, right? Splash! Just as Zhuowen was walking and pondering about the three people on the island, a thunderous sound of water breaking came, and then a huge shadow appeared on the left side of the plank road. The shadow jumped out, and then countless space-time water droplets rushed out, turning into water arrows that rushed toward Zhuowen. Zhuowen's eyes changed, and an ominous feeling suddenly arose. He immediately took out the Emperor sword, and a sword light burst out, turning into a thick barrier. Unfortunately, the barrier didn't last long before it completely collapsed. Zhuowen had no choice but to take out the phagocytosis. The phagocytosis immediately grew to a size of 100 feet, like a unique huge rock, blocking in front of Zhuowen and blocking all the water arrows. At this moment, Zhuowen discovered that the thing in front of him was a huge frog-headed monster. This frog-headed monster was much bigger than the ones he had encountered before. It was 1,000 feet in size. Zhuowen stood in front of this frog-headed monster, as if he was facing a mountain. He seemed insignificant and unreachable. Whoosh! 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 The moment this huge frog-headed monster appeared, small frog-headed monsters immediately drilled out of the surrounding sea. These frog-headed monsters looked at Zhuowen with strong killing intent. Obviously, Zhuowen had killed so many of their companions that these frog-headed monsters completely hated him. Chapter 23-25. Temporal Frog King. What's going on? The Temporal Frog King has appeared. Could it be that a new challenger has appeared? The three of them looked at each other in dismay. Soon after, joy appeared in their eyes as they rushed out of the island and arrived at its edge. Soon after, the three of them saw a white-clothed young man standing on a plank road a few thousand meters away from the island with a huge phagocytosis floating in front of him. Opposite the white-clothed young man was a huge frog-headed monster and a group of smaller frog-headed monsters. What did this guy do? Normally, the Temporal Frog King won't appear when challengers enter the first island. Only those who plan to return the way they came and fail will attract the Temporal Frog King. The middle-aged man's gaze changed slightly as he looked at the huge Temporal Frog King. His body trembled slightly as he muttered in a low voice. Obviously, he was extremely afraid of the Temporal Frog King. It's only the Void Sky 7th step. With such a weak cultivation, this kid will definitely die. The black-clothed man shook his head and said helplessly. On the other hand, the blue-clothed man held a wine pot in his hand as he silently looked at the white-clothed young man standing with a sword. He saw a supreme confidence in the white-clothed young man. This temperament could only be possessed by a true powerhouse. The white-clothed young man's cultivation wasn't high. He was only at the Void Sky 7th step, but he actually had such a temperament. Clearly, this kid wasn't simple. "I'll go help him," the blue-clothed man said as he leaped out and left the island. He was so fast that the middle-aged man and the black-clothed man couldn't react at all. "Second brother, you," the middle-aged man was as anxious as an ant on a hot pan. He also wanted to follow, but after looking at the huge Temporal Frog King and the densely packed temporal frogs around it, the impulse in his heart immediately calmed down. Whoosh! Whoosh! The arrival of the blue-clothed man immediately attracted the attention of the Temporal Frog King and Zhuowen. Zhuowen looked at the blue-clothed man in surprise. How could he not see that the blue-clothed man had come to save him? He didn't expect that there would be such a warm-hearted person in the cold and ruthless world of cultivators. Friend, I am Xiao Lang. This light frog king is not easy to deal with. Xiao Lang is not talented, so I will lend you a hand. Before the man in blue could finish speaking, the sound of something breaking through the air could be heard. The time frogs covering the time frog king threw out space-time water droplets at the man in blue. The expression of the blue-clothed man changed drastically. With a flick of his finger, he took out a long spear. He held the handle of the spear with both hands and suddenly swung it. Immediately, many spear shadows rushed out and blocked all the water droplets that were thrown over. Zhuoan took a deep look at the blue-robed man. This guy was very strong. He was definitely an expert at the peak of the Void Sky 8 steps. Boom. Unfortunately, the blue-clothed man had just blocked that attack when an even more ferocious attack came rushing over from behind. For a moment, the pressure on the blue-robed man increased greatly. Cold sweat dripped down his forehead, and his face turned pale. Thank you, Brother Xiao. You should go back first. I will deal with this light frog king. Zhuoan smiled slightly. Xiao Lang's eyes flickered. Just as he was about to speak, a space-time water droplet broke through his defense and fiercely smashed into his chest. Then, Xiao Lang let out a muffled groan and was sent flying. At the same time, the following space-time water droplets swarmed over and smashed into Xiao Lang's body. The space-time water droplets were too terrifying. If so many space-time water droplets smashed into his body, Xiao Lang knew that he would die without a doubt. Second brother, you are too impulsive. With an explosive shout, the middle-aged man standing on the shore had unknowingly rushed to Xiao Lang's side. Then, the middle-aged man's right hand formed a palm and fiercely blasted out. Boom, boom, boom. An incomparably huge red palm rushed into the sky and blocked the space-time water droplets. The middle-aged man let out a muffled groan and spat out a mouthful of blood before bringing Xiao Lang to the shore. Poochie. After the middle-aged man put down Xiao Lang, he knelt on one knee on the ground and madly spat out blood. His face was extremely pale. Big brother, Xiao Lang crawled up from the ground and immediately went over to the middle-aged man's side to help him up, and his face was covered in shame. The middle-aged man shook his head to indicate that he was fine, and then he said in a low voice, Second brother, you are the strongest amongst us in terms of strength and natural talent. You have the best chance of leaving this place, so I can't allow you to die. Don't do anything stupid. When he spoke up to hear, the middle-aged man gazed at the white-clothed young man with a complicated expression and said, There's no need to pay any attention to him. His cultivation is too low. Unless he is able to comprehend the energy of the spatial laws, otherwise. The middle-aged man shook his head. Obviously, he didn't believe that Zhuoan was able to comprehend the energy of space. The three of them had been trapped here for so long, yet none of them had been able to condense even a trace of the energy of space, let alone Zhuoan who just entered this place. Big brother is right. Second brother, you can't give up. The black-clothed man hurriedly came over to Xiao Lang's side and persuaded. Xiao Lang sighed lightly and sat dejectedly on the ground. He'd suffered a great deal of injuries just now, but his face was slightly red, and he didn't dare look at the white-clothed young man. Earlier, he'd solemnly vowed to save this young man, yet now, he'd been pulled back by his big brother. So, those words of saving the young man were no different than a fart, and he was slightly unable to swallow his pride. Of course, he was even more unwilling to watch the white-clothed young man be killed by the Temporal Frog King before him. The Temporal Frog King glanced indifferently at Xiao Lang's group of three, and then it paid no further attention to them, and its enormous eyes descended onto Zhuoan. You're really bold. You actually killed many of my disciples. How do you want to die? The Temporal Frog King's voice was deafening like thunder. Xiao Lang's group of three came to an understanding when they heard this. No wonder this kid would draw out the Temporal Frog King. It turned out that this kid had killed many temporal frogs. If this kid hadn't killed the temporal frogs and had merely charged through, the Temporal Frog King would absolutely not have appeared. Unfortunately, this kid didn't do that. However, this also caused Xiao Lang's group to have a whole new level of respect for him. Although the temporal frog's strength was far inferior to the Temporal Frog King, they'd always appeared in groups. This wasn't easy to deal with, let alone kill many temporal frogs. Yet, this white-clothed young man was able to do it. Obviously, this white-clothed young man wasn't a simple person. Of course, although Xiao Lang's group of 3 thought highly of Zhuowen, they still didn't think that Zhuowen could survive the Temporal Frog King's attack. The terror of the Temporal Frog King had long been deeply imprinted in their minds after being trapped here for so long, and they were unable to extricate themselves from it for a long time. Zhuowen naturally didn't know what Xiao Lang's group of 3 were thinking. He stood with his sword in hand, and a phagocytosis floated above his head. He looked indifferently at the Temporal Frog King and said, "Your disciples wanted to kill me. Could it be that I'm not allowed to retaliate?" "You're right. It doesn't matter if my disciples and grand disciples kill you. However, it won't do if you kill my disciples and grand disciples. The reason for that is because they are my disciples and grand disciples." The Time Frog King spoke with overflowing killing intent. Zhuowen sneered and said, "Are you that great? I feel that continuing to speak to a fellow who's about to die under my sword is simply a waste of time." Chapter 23-26. Divine Power Display. The Temporal Frog King was so angry that he laughed. He felt that the white-clothed young man in front of him was too arrogant. "Kill him!" The Temporal Frog King roared angrily. The temporal frogs around him threw out space-time water droplets, which bombarded Zhuowen. Zhuowen looked calm as he waved the Emperor sword in his hand. At the same time, the Blood Immortal sword and the Thunder Fire sword turned into 2 streamers of light and floated beside Zhuowen, helping Zhuowen resist the dense space-time water droplets. For a moment, the 2 sides were in a stalemate. "Humph! You really have some skills." The Temporal Frog King sneered. He bounced his legs and jumped out of the water. Suddenly, thousands of waves surged out of the calm sea. It looked extremely spectacular. The lower jaw of the Time Frog King suddenly bulged, and then it spat out a huge water ball that was 1,000 feet in size from its mouth. The water bomb was extremely terrifying. The moment it was blasted out, the entire space-time sea began to distort and deform. The water bomb contained even more terrifying space-time rules. Boom! The water bomb blasted the phagocytosis. Then, the phagocytosis, which had an amazing defense, was blown away by the water bomb. It was on the verge of collapse. Obviously, it could not hold on for long. Bang! 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 The phagocytosis was on the verge of collapse under the attack of the water bomb. Obviously, the Temporal Frog King wanted to follow up with another attack. He once again bulged his lower jaw and spat out another water bomb. Boom! The phagocytosis was finally blown away by the attack of the 2 water bombs. The Blood Immortal sword and the Thunder Fire sword saw that the situation was not right and hid behind Zhuowen. After Zhuowen cursed the 2 guys, he immediately spat out a mouthful of blood on the phagocytosis. Suddenly, the power of the phagocytosis increased greatly. It barely blocked the attack of the Temporal Frog King. However, the Temporal Frog King's attack was too terrifying. Coupled with the attacks of the surrounding temporal frogs, Zhuowen immediately fell into an absolute disadvantage. He was suppressed and could be in danger at any time. The Temporal Frog King is too terrifying. This kid can't hold on for long. On the shore, the middle-aged man shook his head and sighed. His eyes were full of pity. He saw Zhuowen's battle just now and knew that the white-clothed young man in front of him was very powerful. But, he was still no match for the Temporal Frog King. Xiao Lang's eyes were filled with guilt. Just now, he had solemnly vowed to help the white-clothed youth, but now, he could only watch as the white-clothed youth died at the hands of the Time Frog King. Boom! The Time Frog King was right in front of Zhuowen. Its gigantic palm leaf fan-like palm suddenly whizzed over and blasted towards Zhuowen. Gusts of violent wind swept up a terrifying storm, setting off huge waves that were like raging dragons. Translation Frog Translation 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 Jean of Translation Translation of Translation 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 The is that, he, it, that, frog that was that it. Realm. Was. The Temporal Frog King lived in the sea of time and space. If he wanted to hurt it, He would have to use the power of spacetime law. Although Zhuowen had mastered a part of spacetime law and his attack carried a small amount of spacetime law, it only had some effect on the Temporal Frog King. It didn't have much effect on the Temporal Frog King. Waning Sun of the Sea. Zhuowen stood in place and looked at the palm that was getting closer and closer. Then, he pointed his right finger at the void. Suddenly, with Zhuowen as the center, an invisible energy ripple radiated out. Then, the whole space seemed to have come to a standstill. The Temporal Frog King's palm also came to a complete stop at this moment. Whoosh! The seawater behind Zhuowen soared into the sky, forming countless water pillars. Then, behind the water pillars, a waning sun slowly rose. The red light reflected the sea and the sky, forming a rare and beautiful scene. Boom! 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 The moment the waning sun rose, the Temporal Frog King's palm exploded. Terrifying energy swept out, causing the Temporal Frog King to cry out and retreat repeatedly. Moreover, as the waning sun continued to rise, the power became more and more terrifying. The Temporal Frog King's huge body kept exploding, and blood spurted out like rain. It looked extremely miserable. It wasn't just the Temporal Frog King. Wherever the waning sun shone, terrifying energy would set off. The densely packed temporal frogs all exploded into clouds of blood mist under the power of the waning sun. When the waning sun rose to the highest point, the Temporal Frog King wailed, and its huge body exploded into a huge cloud of blood mist. In the end, its face was blurry, leaving only an incomplete corpse floating on the sea. This, Xiao Lang and the other two, who were standing on the shore, were stunned as if they had been struck by lightning. They stared blankly at the unbelievable scene in front of them. The Temporal Frog King was killed just like that. Wasn't it too simple? In the beginning, the Temporal Frog King was suppressing the white-clothed young man. Now, it was killed in the blink of an eye. Moreover, it was done so cleanly that the three of them couldn't even react. That's a divine ability that contains the laws of space-time. Could it be that this kid created it by comprehending the laws of space-time? Xiao Lang was the first to react. He stared at the white-clothed young man with awe and murmured in a low voice. Not only Xiao Lang, but the middle-aged man and the black-clothed man beside him also showed fear and awe. However, there was also a trace of excitement in their awe. The fact that the white-clothed young man in front of them possessed the divine ability of the laws of spacetime meant that this kid was likely to pass the trial smoothly. At that time, the three of them might be rescued. After killing the Temporal Frog King, Zhuowen was panting and his face was quite pale. He could only use the waning sun at the sea once. After using it, he would become very weak. He could only use it again after he slowly recovered. Zhuowen sat cross-legged on the plank road. He was not in a hurry to go to the plank road. Instead, he asked Xiao He and the Blood Celestial Sword to guard him while he focused on recuperating and recovering his divine power. One must always be on guard against others. Although Xiao Lang and the other two didn't look like villains, they had never met Zhuowen before. Therefore, Zhuowen naturally couldn't just walk over like that. He had to wait until he recovered first. Xiao Lang and the other two naturally couldn't go forward rashly. Zhuowen's behavior had already indicated that they couldn't get close at the moment. Therefore, the three of them stood on the shore and waited silently. 4 hours later, Zhuowen's divine power recovered a little. He immediately stood up and walked toward the shore. "Thank you, brother." When Zhuowen walked to the shore, Xiao Lang and the other two immediately cupped their hands and thanked him. Zhuowen looked surprised and said, "The three of you must have misunderstood. I didn't do anything for you. Why should I thank you?" Xiao Lang quickly explained, "Brother, you don't know. The Temporal Frog King has been guarding outside the island. It doesn't allow cultivators to leave the island. Once they leave the island, they will be killed by the Temporal Frog King." Chapter 23-27. The checkpoint. Zhuowen was startled, then he asked, "You want to go back the way you came?" Xiao Lang nodded and said, "Yes. Back then, we accidentally entered this training ground. This was our first stop, but after entering this island, We no longer had enough strength to continue forward, so we want to go back the way we came and leave this place. Zhuowen narrowed his eyes and said in a deep voice, I am Zhuowen. I am new here, so I don't know much about this place. Can the three of you tell me more about this place? When the three heard this, they looked at each other. In the end, Xiao Lang smiled and said, Of course. I don't think anyone who can enter this place is an ordinary person. Actually, it's like this. Zhuowen listened to Xiao Lang in silence. He had a rough understanding of this place. Xiao Lang and the other two were three brothers. They were also famous loose cultivators in the Six Desires heavenly domain. Xiao Lang was the second brother. His eldest brother was called Xiao Yin, and his third brother was called Xiao Fu. Among the three of them, Xiao Lang had the highest talent and strength. His strength had reached the peak of the 8 steps void sky. When the three Xiao brothers heard that there was a part of the space-time wheel in the river of space-time quicksand, they naturally wanted the space-time wheel. They entered the depths of the river of space-time quicksand and finally arrived at the base of the cliff in the depths of the sea. After they entered the base of the cliff, they also encountered the mysterious head. However, the mysterious head did not talk nonsense with the three of them. It only said that if they wanted to obtain the space-time key, then they should go back to the training ground. The three of them did not even have time to react. Their bodies were eternally frozen at a certain point in time, and their souls were transported to this training ground. They came to this island in the first checkpoint, but when they wanted to pass the next checkpoint, they found that they did not have enough understanding of the space-time law. It was impossible for them to pass the second checkpoint. Therefore, they stayed on this island for thousands of years. It was so long that they almost lost track of time. At first, there were many other cultivators here. A small number of cultivators comprehended the power of the space-time law and successfully passed the second checkpoint and left this place. Most of the other cultivators could not bear the loneliness of this place and wanted to go back the way they came. Unfortunately, it was easy to enter but difficult to leave. Once one intended to leave the island, the Time Frog King would appear and wipe out all the cultivators who intended to leave. In the end, the cultivators on the island either left or died. In the end, only the three brothers were left. Even so, the three brothers were on the verge of collapse. If it wasn't for Zhuowen's appearance, Xiao Lang would have probably gone to the Time Frog King to seek death. After listening to the three brothers, a puzzled look appeared on Zhuowen's face. Based on what the three of them had said, it seemed like they had arrived in this space the moment they entered the trial grounds. They hadn't entered the place where Zhuowen had comprehended the setting sun. However, Zhuowen had entered that strange space and comprehended a space-time divine ability that belonged solely to him. Could this have been arranged by the mysterious head? He also found out from the three of them that it was his soul that had entered this place, not his physical body. Although it was his divine soul that entered this trial space, this space was very strange. He could use the divine weapons in his spiritual ring and his own divine abilities, and it would not affect his strength. Are you planning to go back the way you came? Zhuowen asked with a frown. Yes, Brother Zhuo. Is there a problem? Xiao Lang said with a smile. With all due respect, when I entered this space, I couldn't even distinguish the entrance. If you go back the way you came, I'm afraid. Zhuowen didn't finish his sentence, but he knew that Xiao Lang and the other two should know what he meant. Sure enough, Xiao Lang and the other two looked at each other helplessly. Then, Xiao Lang cupped his fists and said, Thank you, Brother Zhuo, for reminding us. It seems that we have to continue waiting. Speaking of this, Xiao Lang looked at Zhuowen with a burning gaze. When Zhuowen used the sun waning above the sea, he could feel that this white-clothed young man in front of him was very likely to pass this trial. He had seen many cultivators who had entered this trial, but it was the first time he had seen someone who could create their own space-time divine ability. Brother Zhuo, the strength of this place is mostly determined by the depth of your understanding of the space-time law. Although you are only at the void sky 7th step, you have created your own space-time divine ability. You are much stronger than the three of us. Speaking of this, Xiao Lang said excitedly, Brother Zhuo, maybe you can be the first person to pass this trial. Zhuowen's expression was calm. He didn't show any complacency because of Xiao Lang's praise. Instead, he said in a deep voice, "Before we pass, I hope that Brother Xiao can tell me in detail everything you know about this trial space." This time, Zhuowen mainly came for the spacetime key. If he wanted to get the spacetime key, he had to pass this trial. Although he had the help of the mysterious head, Zhuowen wanted to succeed, so he naturally wanted to know more. After all, know yourself and know your enemy, and you will never be defeated. Actually, it's like this. There are a total of 3 stages in this trial. This is only the first stage. There are 2 more stages after that. Moreover, every stage has a corresponding reward. Moreover, the further you go, the more generous the rewards are, Xiaolang quickly said. Reward. Zhuowen looked at Xiaolang in confusion. Xiaolang smiled and said, "Brother Zhuo, don't worry. You have passed the first stage, so you will naturally have a corresponding reward. When the time comes, go to the center of the island, and the reward will be there. This is the reward given by the trial space, and it is different for everyone. It is said that the reward will be given based on the performance of the challenger. The better the performance, the more generous the reward. With Brother Zhuo's previous performance, I think the reward will definitely be extraordinary." Zhuowen nodded in understanding. It seemed that when the time came, he would have to go to the center of the island to have a look. He wondered what kind of reward this trial space would give him. When the challenger passes the 3 stages, it is said that they will obtain the spacetime key. The spacetime key is a good thing. I only learned about it after I was teleported here. It turns out that such a good thing as the spacetime key was hidden in the river of spacetime quicksand. Speaking of this, Xiaolang's eyes were full of excitement. It was obvious that he had a strong desire for the spacetime key. Hearing this, Zhuowen sighed softly. It seemed that in the 6 Desires heavenly realm, there was basically no one who knew that the spacetime key was in the river of spacetime quicksand. Thinking about it, if the news of the spacetime key were to spread, it would attract the interest of many old monsters. Even the cultivators of the Void Sky 9 steps would come out. The river of spacetime quicksand would not be so deserted, and a mere quicksand family would not be able to protect such a precious place like the river of spacetime quicksand. Where is the entrance to the second stage? Zhuowen suddenly asked. Xiaolang was startled and immediately said, "It is also in the center of the island." However, the second stage is more humane. Even if the challenger is not strong enough, as long as they do not die in the stage, they can return to the first island. The 3 of us have already tried several times, but we have all failed. When they spoke up to hear, the 3 brothers sighed dejectedly. Zhuowen nodded and said, "Take me to the center of the island." You're tuning in to the Celestial War YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories,